The summer of 1985 was scorching hot, the air thick with the scent of fear and dread. In the dark corners of Los Angeles, a monster prowled, his presence more terrifying than any nightmare. His name was Richard Ramirez, but the world would come to know him as the Night Stalker. Under the cover of night, he slithered into homes, his cold eyes searching for his next victim, leaving behind a trail of blood, terror, and broken lives. With every crime, his thirst for pain and suffering grew, as did the horror he instilled in the hearts of the people he stalked. What made this killer so chilling wasn't just the violence of his actions, but the sheer unpredictability. He didn't have a pattern. He didn't care about race, age, or gender. If you were asleep when he came for you, your life could be over in an instant, brutally, violently, and without mercy. Richard Ramirez was no ordinary killer. He was the embodiment of every horror movie villain come to life. But this was no fiction. It was real, and it was happening. The terror lasted for months, and with each passing day, the people of Southern California were haunted by the ever-looming question: who would be next? Welcome to Crime Headquarters. I know many of you enjoy these stories to unwind and drift off to sleep, and tonight, you're in for something truly chilling and tragic. We'll be telling 5 different true crime stories in this video, each one more haunting than the last. So, get cozy, whether you're in bed or somewhere comfortable, and let go of the day. Before you let your mind drift off, take a moment to subscribe, like, share, and comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, feel free to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and get ready. This is the story The Night Stalker. The night was suffocating. A blanket of silence hung over Los Angeles, broken only by the occasional creak of an old house or the distant hum of a car. The city's streets, normally bustling with life, seemed empty in the late hours, the dim streetlights casting long, eerie shadows on the cracked sidewalks. Yet, beneath this cloak of stillness, a predator was moving. Richard Ramirez, with his wild eyes, unruly hair, and a grin that sent shivers down the spine of anyone who crossed his path, was about to begin his reign of terror. In the beginning, the attacks seemed random. One night, it would be a home invasion, the next, an assault, followed by a gruesome killing. He was careful, never leaving behind the same pattern, and each crime seemed more heinous than the last. But that was precisely the horror of it. There was no way to predict when or where he would strike next. No one was safe. It all started in the summer of 1984. The first known murder that could be attributed to Ramirez was the brutal slaying of 79-year-old Jenny Vincow. She lived alone in her modest home in the Echo Park neighborhood. Her death was a shock, a violent, senseless act that left police scrambling for answers. Jenny was found savagely stabbed, her body mutilated in a way that defied the imagination. But in the beginning, there was no clue as to who could have committed such an unspeakable act. Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning of what would become a spree of unimaginable violence. Ramirez's modus operandi was chilling in its randomness. He would often enter homes through unlocked windows or doors, sometimes just slipping in as though he were a shadow. His victims would be completely unaware of his presence until the terror began. He had no preference for race or gender. He was an equal opportunity killer, choosing his targets seemingly at random, and his violence knew no bounds. His actions were swift, brutal, and savage, leaving entire families shattered and communities in constant fear. His attacks were unpredictable and violent. In many cases, Ramirez would assault, then kill, his victims with terrifying brutality. There was often sexual assault involved, and the killer showed no remorse for the suffering he caused. He would leave his victims to die, sometimes forcing them to swear an oath of silence before delivering the final blow. The sheer cruelty of it all, the physical and psychological torment he inflicted, was more horrifying than the murders themselves. But it wasn't just the physical brutality that made Ramirez so terrifying. It was the way he seemed to take pleasure in inflicting pain, the way he thrived on terror. His murders were often followed by strange, cryptic messages, symbols, markings, or words that hinted at the twisted philosophy that drove him. A pentagram, drawn in blood on the walls of one victim's home, was one of the first signs of the demonic influences that seemed to haunt Ramirez's mind. It was a clear signal that this was not just a serial killer. It was something far darker, something driven by pure evil. One of his most infamous murders occurred on the night of March 17, 1985. A couple, Maria Hernandez and her roommate, Dale Okazaki, were asleep in their small home in Rosemead, California. Ramirez entered through an open window, and his first victim that night was Maria. After shooting her in the face, he believed she was dead but didn't check thoroughly. As he turned to leave, Maria miraculously survived, despite her critical wounds, and managed to crawl to safety. But that didn't stop him. He moved on to Dale, and in a horrifying act of violence, he shot her execution style in the head, killing her instantly. This wasn't just a random attack. It was cold-blooded, calculated, and merciless. Ramirez seemed to enjoy the horror he caused, feeding off the chaos he unleashed. What made him even more terrifying was the eerie calmness with which he operated. There were no emotions, no hesitation, just pure, relentless violence. As the attacks continued, people in Southern California began to live in a state of constant fear. It wasn't just the brutality of the killings that terrified them. It was the fact that the killer seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. He struck in the middle of the night, when families were asleep, when they felt the safest. No one was safe behind closed doors. No one could predict when the next horrifying act would take place. Then came the night of July 20th, 1985, one that would become the turning point in the search for the killer. Ramirez, who had been leaving cryptic messages at the crime scenes, finally made a mistake. He targeted a home in Glendale, California, where a young couple, a husband and wife, were asleep. After entering the home, he attacked the couple, forcing the wife to watch as he brutalized her husband. But this time, something went wrong. The wife managed to survive the attack and gave a detailed description of the man who had attacked them. The description was chilling, but at least it gave investigators something to work with. Ramirez was no longer a faceless figure in the dark. He had been seen. The authorities, desperate for leads, launched a massive manhunt, scouring the streets, interviewing hundreds of people, and following up on tips. But Richard Ramirez was no ordinary killer. He was elusive, a ghost in the shadows, slipping away just when it seemed like they might close in. It wasn't until later, when the case had already spiraled into madness, that Ramirez would be identified. In the midst of the chaos and fear he created, the Night Stalker, as he had been dubbed by the press, continued his spree, leaving an ever-growing trail of destruction. Families torn apart, homes broken into, lives lost. Each murder was more vicious, more chilling than the last. But all monsters make mistakes, and Richard Ramirez's would come when he least expected it. The city of Los Angeles, once buzzing with the usual sounds of life, was now choked with a dense, suffocating fear. The streets, once filled with people living their lives, were now empty husks where even the bravest hearts walked with trepidation. Every creak of a floorboard, every rattle of a window, had people flinching, wondering if tonight was the night they would meet the horror that had become the Night Stalker's signature. Richard Ramirez had become a shadow in their minds, an invisible killer who haunted the most intimate parts of their existence, striking without warning, leaving only death and terror in his wake. But Ramirez was not content with mere brutality. His actions were becoming more and more ritualistic, more deeply twisted. With each murder, he seemed to be slipping further into his own madness, as though some dark force was propelling him forward, urging him to leave not just a body, but a message. His victims were no longer simply his prey. They were pawns in a terrifying game he was playing, a game that he believed he had already won. On March 17, 1985, after Ramirez had shot Maria Hernandez and executed her roommate Dale Okazaki, he didn't stop. His bloodlust was insatiable, and the brutality he inflicted was escalating to new, horrifying levels. After leaving a bloodbath behind him, he decided to strike again in the quiet, suburban neighborhood of Glendale, California. This was his pattern. He would wander, sometimes with no clear destination, and find another family to ruin. That night, he entered the home of Lillian and Manuel, a couple of humble means. The husband and wife were sleeping in their bed when the door creaked open, signaling the arrival of their tormentor. At first, they thought it was a bad dream, that maybe the sounds were just the house settling. But then came the heavy footsteps, followed by a cold voice ordering them to wake up. Ramirez had entered through an unlocked door, always the same method, always the same surprise. Before they could even register what was happening, Ramirez fired a shot into Manuel's chest. The force of the impact threw him back onto the bed, blood spraying across the walls in a grotesque pattern. Lillian screamed, the sound piercing the night like the wail of a tortured soul. But her screams were cut short when Ramirez turned to her and demanded she get up. His voice was calm, eerily calm for someone committing such horrors. He forced Lillian to lead him to a nearby closet. There, he tied her up, doing so with mechanical precision. In a way, it was as though Ramirez had done this before, this sick dance of cruelty and control. It wasn't enough for him to kill. He had to dominate, to strip his victims of their humanity before he ended their lives. Once he was done, he forced Lillian to lay still, her heart racing in her chest, pumping a cocktail of pure fear and confusion through her veins. But then the unthinkable happened. Lillian had survived the worst, but she had one last chance, an opportunity to escape. She willed herself to be quiet, to blend into the shadows of her own terror, and wait for him to lose focus. Ramirez, too, was consumed with his own twisted desire to enjoy the moment. In his sickened mind, he wanted to feel the power, the total control over life and death that his actions gave him. What he didn't realize, however, was that in his desire to savor the pain, he had left Lillian alone. Vulnerable, yes, but alive. She took that chance. She escaped from the ropes that bound her, crawled toward the door, and ran out into the dark, blood-stained night. In her escape, she became his first survivor, but not before leaving the world with a description of a man who was a devil in human form. Tall, with long, dark hair and wild eyes. A grin that only monsters wore. But Ramirez didn't care. He hadn't been caught, and he was already thinking about his next victim. The survivor's description was irrelevant to him. The hunt was what mattered. That description, however, would lead to the breakthrough the police desperately needed. In a twist of fate, Lillian's escape became the very thing that set the wheels of justice into motion. But even that seemed to take forever. As his death toll climbed, Richard Ramirez began to feel the net closing in on him. Every time he struck, he became more confident, bolder, and crueler. No one was safe. His assaults were not just physical, they were psychological too. He terrorized entire communities, watching them unravel in fear. As the months went on, the body count grew. On July 20th, 1985, Ramirez would make his most notorious attack yet. The crime was unthinkable. He'd gone from an intruder to a killer to something far more monstrous. His target was the cousin's family, a suburban household that had no reason to fear a predator like him. The father, William, his wife Yolanda, and their teenage daughter Stephanie were sound asleep when Ramirez crept into their home. He shot William in the face first. The horrific sound of the bullet breaking through his skull filled the quiet night. But what followed was even worse. Ramirez didn't stop at the father. He tied up the mother and daughter, forcing them to watch in terror as he brutalized William's body. There was something methodical in Ramirez's actions, like he was savoring the fear, drinking it in as a drunkard does wine. But then, in a move that would forever be burned into the minds of the survivors, Ramirez forced Yolanda and Stephanie to commit acts of unimaginable horror. The rapes, the humiliation, the terror, it was all part of his sick plan. When he was done, the brutality was such that the crime scene left investigators unable to process the depth of cruelty. He didn't just kill them, he destroyed them mentally, spiritually, and physically. It was a crime so grotesque that even the hardened detectives were visibly shaken. But still, there were no arrests. No one knew who the killer was. The survivors, too terrified to speak up, were left struggling with the trauma of their encounter. With each attack, Ramirez's methods became even more erratic. He'd grow more erratic, more panicked. Every home invasion, every life snuffed out, became a gamble with fate. But his reign of terror couldn't last forever. Even though his kills were escalating, becoming more violent, more brutal, he was still a ghost in the night, eluding authorities. It was as though his twisted nature had given him an immunity to capture. But like all monstrous things that stalk the earth, Richard Ramirez made one fatal mistake. He became careless. Too confident in his ability to remain unseen, too reckless in his desire to inflict terror, he left his mark. The police, after countless dead ends and sleepless nights, finally had a breakthrough. A grainy image from a witness, a few connections that began to form, and soon, Ramirez's face was splashed across every news outlet in the country. The Night Stalker had been identified. As the manhunt continued, the killer's desperation grew. It wasn't just about the murders anymore. The thrill had gone. Now it was survival. And that is when Richard Ramirez slipped. It was a mistake that would forever change the course of history. The night that he was finally identified, he was spotted in a parking lot by a group of citizens who, after hearing his name broadcast on the radio, immediately recognized him. The once feared killer was now the hunted. The eerie silence that had plagued Southern California for so many months was shattered by a single, pivotal moment. The Night Stalker was no longer a nameless terror in the shadows. The hunter had become the hunted. Richard Ramirez, the man who had turned entire communities into trembling wrecks, was about to be confronted by something more terrifying than his wildest nightmares. A world that was finally closing in on him. His spree had gone on far longer than anyone could have predicted, but as with all monsters, his hubris would prove to be his downfall. It had been the smallest of errors, the kind that even the most meticulous killer could make when the hunt had gone on too long. On August 30th, 1985, Ramirez was walking through the streets of East Los Angeles, unaware that he was about to make history. He had just attempted yet another assault. His hands still stained with the blood of his latest victims, and his mind clouded with the thrill of terror he had just instilled in yet another family. But fate had other plans. As he passed through a neighborhood, a group of local residents noticed the man from a police sketch that had been circulating. Their eyes locked on him, and in that moment, they knew. This wasn't just any man. They had seen his face before. This was the monster that had haunted their streets for months. With the air thick with the tension of impending justice, these vigilant citizens didn't hesitate. They knew the horrors this man had inflicted, and they had had enough. They screamed at him, demanding that he stop, but the devil himself only ran. His legs carried him faster than he had ever moved, but it was too late. The streets were already alive with the thundering footsteps of more witnesses, and before he could escape into the shadows, a police car appeared on the scene. The chase was short, but to Ramirez it must have felt like a hell he was trying to outrun. Caught like an animal in a trap, there was no escape. He had been captured. His reign of terror was over. As Richard Ramirez was handcuffed and thrown into the back of a police car, his infamous smile, an unsettling grin that had long been a mark of his sadistic glee, seemed to flicker, though only for a moment. His eyes darted around, wild and desperate, as though he realized, at last, that the nightmare was over. But no longer would he be the one stalking from the darkness. Now he would be the prey. In the weeks that followed his arrest, the public was gripped by the unraveling of Ramirez's story. The full extent of his violence, his depravity, and his twisted motives began to come to light, and the world shuddered at the sheer scale of his monstrosity. He was no longer a mere criminal. He had become an embodiment of evil itself. What came next was a deeply disturbing trial that only amplified the darkness surrounding Richard Ramirez. As the evidence piled up, it became clear just how far the Night Stalker had gone in his thirst for chaos. The body count continued to rise, but so did the brutality of his methods. Ramirez's attacks were far from the simple, cold-blooded murders of other killers. His were the kind of violent acts that struck fear into the core of humanity. His victims were often mutilated in ways that defied understanding. He left behind more than just bodies. He left behind a trail of shattered lives, all marked by the hellish horror of his actions. In some cases, Ramirez would enter homes through unlocked doors or windows, completely undetected. He'd then awaken his victims, dragging them from their beds, forcing them into a living nightmare. He would often force his victims to swear their allegiance to Satan, branding his crimes with sickeningly cryptic phrases and markings, like the pentagrams he carved on walls in blood or spray-painted on the floors of his victims' homes. These symbols were his signature, his mark of power over life and death. To him, they were the ultimate expression of his dominance over his victims. Each act was a sacrifice to something darker, something even more terrifying than the physical violence he inflicted. His preferred weapon was a .22 caliber handgun, which he would use with terrifying precision. But what truly set Ramirez apart from other serial killers was his complete lack of remorse. The mere act of murder was not enough. He sought to break the spirits of his victims, to strip away their dignity and force them to live in fear before they died. His actions were calculated to hurt, to maim both physically and psychologically. He was not just a killer, he was a sadist, deriving twisted pleasure from the suffering of others. In the months after his arrest, the public became obsessed with the details of his case. In interviews with detectives, Ramirez revealed the extent of his depravity, openly admitting to the murders without an ounce of remorse. When he spoke, his words seemed to drip with venom. He showed no guilt for the families he had torn apart, no regret for the bloodshed he had caused, and even more chillingly, he never stopped to question the darkness that drove him. To him, the murders were simply part of a larger plan, a ritual, a sacrifice to the devil that he had been chosen to perform. In court, Ramirez's behavior grew more bizarre. He openly declared his allegiance to Satan, frequently making strange hand gestures, including the horns gesture, which became his trademark. The world watched in horror as the man they had once feared now sat in front of them, unrepentant and filled with a perverse pride. It became clear that Richard Ramirez had been consumed by a darkness so profound that he had become a living embodiment of evil itself. But there was something deeply unsettling about Ramirez's demeanor during the trial. It wasn't just the satanic gestures or the bizarre behavior, it was the way he seemed to relish the attention. He was playing a game, a twisted game of cat and mouse, where the stakes were human lives, and the prize was his twisted sense of superiority. The trial was long, spanning months, and it felt like an eternity for the victims' families and the people of Southern California. As the case progressed, the details of his reign of terror only became more and more horrifying. The sheer unpredictability of his attacks, his willingness to strike anywhere, at any time, regardless of who his victims were, made him even more terrifying. He had no rules, no moral compass, no boundary that he wouldn't cross to create chaos. To Ramirez, every life was expendable, every person just another plaything for his sadistic desires. In the end, the jury didn't need to deliberate long. The evidence was overwhelming, too much to deny. In 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. He was sentenced to death, and although he would spend the rest of his life on death row, he would never see the light of freedom again. But the story didn't end with his conviction. For Ramirez, death row was not a place of reflection or remorse. It was just another stage for his twisted performance. He continued to taunt the public with bizarre, rambling interviews, always hungry for the attention that had once been his fuel for terror. Even behind bars, he remained a symbol of the unchecked evil that had once roamed free in the streets of Los Angeles. Years went by, and though he was locked away in a cell, Ramirez's legacy only grew darker. His name became synonymous with fear, with terror, with the unknown. His crimes were etched into the fabric of history as some of the most heinous acts ever committed by one man. He was a ghost who haunted the memories of the survivors, the families, and the city he had terrorized for so long. But like all monsters, his time eventually ran out. In 2013, Richard Ramirez died of complications from cancer at the age of 53. His death marked the end of an era of fear in California, but the damage he had done, the lives he had destroyed, could never be undone. He was gone, but the nightmare he left behind would never truly fade. The last breath of Richard Ramirez left his lungs in 2013, But in the decades that followed his reign of terror, the shadows he cast over California never truly faded. His name became synonymous with fear, and the stories of his victims lived on, etched in the collective memory of a city that had once trembled under his grip. He was no longer the face in the dark, the elusive killer stalking the night, but the memory of the Night Stalker would remain long after the man himself had passed. His crimes had left an indelible mark on history, one that would continue to haunt generations. Though Richard Ramirez's physical body had been swallowed by death, the true horror of his legacy lay not in the man himself, but in the terror he had instilled in an entire community. No one would ever forget the primal fear that permeated every neighborhood in Los Angeles, the silent terror that gripped people as they closed their windows at night, hoping the monster would overlook their homes. But for the survivors, the families who had lost everything, the echoes of Ramirez's brutality would never stop haunting them. The victims, those who were left behind, lived in a world that could never be the same again. To understand the true impact of Ramirez's actions, we must look at the lives he destroyed, the families left shattered in the wake of his violence. Each of his victims carried the weight of trauma, their lives forever marked by the twisted imprint of his cruelty. Take Bill and Maria Garcia, for example. When the Night Stalker targeted their home on August 18, 1985, their lives were torn apart in an instant. Bill, Maria, and their young daughter, Christina, had no idea what kind of monster was about to breach their doors. Ramirez entered their home in the middle of the night, and when Maria screamed, he shot Bill in the face, his blood splattering across his wife and daughter. He then sexually assaulted Maria before shooting her and leaving her for dead. Christina, terrified and forced to watch the murder of her parents, was left to navigate the horror of being an orphan, her childhood shattered forever by the events of that night. It wasn't just the immediate brutality of the murders that devastated the families. It was the ripples of psychological horror that spread outward, consuming everything in its path. Survivors lived with the constant fear that they would never be able to outrun the shadows of that night. The trauma wasn't just physical. It went deeper than broken bones and bruised bodies. It took root in the hearts and minds of everyone who had encountered the Night Stalker. Many victims were left struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by nightmares of Ramirez's face, of being trapped in their own homes, of hearing the sounds of footsteps echoing through the halls as they waited for death to come. But it wasn't just the survivors who carried the scars of Ramirez's brutality. The police officers and detectives who had been involved in the investigation, those who had searched for months without finding any solid leads, were also affected. They spent sleepless nights chasing ghosts, piecing together fragments of a puzzle that never seemed to fit. The frustration of coming so close, of knowing that the killer was out there, and yet having nothing concrete to hold on to, was maddening. As the body count grew, so did the pressure. The streets of Los Angeles were becoming a battleground, a war between law enforcement and an enemy who seemed to be untouchable, unstoppable. Detective Gil Carrillo, one of the lead investigators in the case, was haunted by the horror that Ramirez had inflicted on the city. He spent countless hours in dark rooms, combing through evidence, chasing down witnesses, trying to understand the mind of a monster who seemed to have no conscience, no remorse. It was as if we were dealing with a phantom, Carrillo said later. There were no leads, no patterns, and each murder seemed to get more violent, more depraved than the last. Ramirez had managed to elude capture for so long because he didn't just kill randomly. He chose his victims with terrifying precision. He had no rules, no boundaries, and this made him unpredictable. In some instances, he had even been known to stalk the homes of his victims before he struck. He would quietly observe, learning their routines, studying their weaknesses, and then, in the dead of night, strike with the savagery of a predator. It was this methodical, cold-blooded approach that made him such a nightmare to track down. For months, it seemed as though he was a ghost, slipping through the fingers of those who were desperate to find him. Then, there were the survivors, those few who managed to survive his attacks, whether by sheer luck or by an iron-willed strength. For these people, the memory of what had happened to them never faded. Some survivors, like Maria Hernandez, the woman who survived the attack on March 17, 1985, would go on to live relatively normal lives, but the scars, mental and emotional, would remain with them forever. Every night, every creak of a floorboard, every unexpected sound brought back memories of the horror they had endured. The faces of the victims, the flash of Ramirez's gun, the sounds of his footsteps would replay in their minds like a looping nightmare. But the story of Richard Ramirez didn't just affect the victims, the families, and the investigators. It seeped into the cultural fabric of America. The media played a crucial role in shaping Ramirez's legacy. The media frenzy surrounding the case only amplified the fear. News outlets and journalists followed the case obsessively, covering every grisly detail, every new clue, every horrifying revelation. By the time Ramirez was caught, his image was burned into the public consciousness. His face, his wild eyes, and his sinister smile became icons of fear, representing something far darker than any fictional villain could ever embody. But it wasn't just the killer's image that stuck with people, it was the reality of his violence. The terror he unleashed was something that had never been seen before on such a scale. People stopped leaving their windows open at night. Parents warned their children to never walk alone. The homes of Los Angeles became fortresses, and the streets became places of danger. Ramirez didn't just kill people. He killed the sense of safety, the sense of peace that had once existed in the city. As the years went on, and Ramirez's crimes were discussed in documentaries, books, and news segments, his legacy of fear continued to loom large. Even after his death, his influence continued to be felt. His story was endlessly recounted, his face still plastered across the front pages of true crime magazines and websites. The Night Stalker had become more than a man. He had become a symbol of terror, a warning that even in a world filled with laws and order, there are forces that exist beyond comprehension. The very fact that Ramirez's name is still spoken with dread all these years later speaks volumes about the magnitude of his crimes. His impact was far-reaching, and his actions forever altered the way people saw the world. The Night Stalker may have died in prison, but the darkness he unleashed on the world remains ever present. His legacy lives on in the survivors, in the families, in the police officers who gave everything to bring him to justice, and in the collective memory of a city forever changed by the nightmare that stalked it. Richard Ramirez was, and always will be, a symbol of the evil that can exist in the world. His story is a reminder that sometimes nightmares aren't confined to sleep. Sometimes they walk among us. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2, the Hinterkaifeck Murders, a brutal family massacre in Germany, where a family was killed on their farm. In the quiet, isolated fields of rural Germany, where the cold winds whip across the lonely farmlands, a horror unlike any other took place. Hinterkaifeck, a small, remote farmstead, once seemed like a peaceful haven for the Gruber family, a place where they could live simple lives and escape the chaos of the world. But one fateful night in 1922, everything changed. A brutal massacre unfolded within the walls of this desolate farm. A murder so gruesome, so mysterious, that it would haunt Germany for decades to come. 6 people, a family of 5 and their maid, were found dead in their own home, their bodies horribly mutilated, with no sign of who could have done it. The killer was everywhere and nowhere. He stalked the house for days, and the family had no idea they were already living in the presence of death. As police arrived at the scene, they were confronted with a puzzle so twisted, so eerie, that even the bravest officers would later confess to being shaken by what they uncovered. The family had been slaughtered without mercy, yet the killer lingered for days in the home, eating their food, using their belongings, and even tending to their livestock. What kind of monster could commit such horrors? And why would they return to the scene of their crime, undetected time and time again? The Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of the most terrifying, unsolved crimes in German history. A case that twists the mind, one that leaves you questioning how well you really know the world around you. Could the killer have been someone they knew? Or did a shadowy stranger, hiding in the very house, take their lives with such cruelty that it still lingers in the bones of the land? Tonight, we delve into the heart of one of the most chilling and baffling murder mysteries ever to stain the soil of Germany, the Hinterkaifeck murders. The year was 1922, a time when the world was recovering from the aftermath of World War I. Yet in the small rural town of Kaifeck, life seemed to move at its own pace. The Gruber family lived on a remote farm, surrounded by thick forests and vast, empty fields. It was a quiet existence, simple, hard-working folk, living far from the watchful eyes of the outside world. The farm had been in the family for generations, and for a time, it was a place of warmth, love, and peace. But no one could have known how much darkness lurked beneath the surface of this idyllic life. A darkness that would erupt into one of the most brutal and perplexing family massacres Germany has ever seen. The Gruber family consisted of Andreas Gruber, a 63-year-old farmer, his wife Cecilia, aged 72, their 35-year-old daughter Victoria, and her two children, Cecilia, a 7-year-old girl, and Joseph, a 2-year-old boy. Alongside them worked their maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had only recently started living with the family. The family had no idea that their seemingly ordinary lives were about to take a nightmarish turn. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, it began just like any other evening. The family gathered in the warmth of their home, preparing for bed as the dark, cold night settled over their farm. But somewhere in the shadows of that night, something sinister was creeping closer. Little did they know that their killer was already lurking nearby, or perhaps even already inside their home, hidden within the very walls of the farmhouse. The first to die was Andreas Gruber. Late that night, while the family slept in their rooms upstairs, Andreas, a large, imposing figure, was brutally attacked. He had been struck with a blunt object, possibly an axe, in the head. The blow was powerful enough to kill him almost instantly. But this was just the beginning. The murderer or murderers did not stop there. The killer made his way through the house, systematically slaughtering each member of the Gruber family. In the next room, Cecilia was attacked and murdered with the same horrifying brutality. Her screams were silenced by the killer, but her blood remained, splattered across the room. Meanwhile, young Cecilia and Joseph were slaughtered in their sleep, their innocent lives snuffed out in an instant. The method of their murders was so violent, so savage, that it left the police who would later investigate the scene reeling in disbelief. The final victim that night was Maria Baumgartner, the maid who had been living with the family for only a short time. She had gone to bed earlier that night, unaware of the horrors unfolding just downstairs. But in the dead of night, the killer found his way to her room, and she too was murdered with sickening efficiency. Her body was found in the same gruesome state as the others, brutally bludgeoned, her life taken with no hesitation or remorse. At some point during the killing spree, the murderer had entered and left the house, perhaps to gather his strength or to wait for the right moment. The killer was not in a rush. He took his time, methodically going from room to room, ensuring each victim was dead before moving on to the next. Yet, despite the horrific brutality of the attacks, there was no sign of forced entry. The doors were locked, the windows shut. How could someone have entered the home without being seen? How had the family never noticed? The police were horrified when they arrived at the scene, but what they found next would chill them to the core. The murderer had not fled the scene. He had stayed behind. For days after the massacre, neighbors in the area noticed something unusual about the farm. Despite the gruesome killings, the livestock, cattle, horses, and chickens, were still alive and well. The killer had stayed inside the house, living among the dead. He had fed the animals, made use of the family's food, and continued to live in the very home where he had just butchered 5 people. Days passed, and the family's disappearance began to worry the neighbors. but the killer remained hidden. It was only when a local maid went to the house to clean that the first hint of the crime was uncovered. She noticed something odd. The house appeared empty, but there were signs of someone having lived there recently. Dirty dishes were left out, beds were unmade, and the air was thick with an unsettling stillness. She went inside and discovered the gruesome reality. The family's bodies were sprawled across the house in various stages of decay. The horror didn't end with the discovery of the bodies. As the police entered the farmhouse, they began to piece together what had happened. What was most chilling, however, was the complete lack of evidence. No one had heard any screams. No neighbors had seen anyone coming or going. The killer had left no trace, no fingerprints, and only the slightest clues that suggested who could have committed the crime. The weapon was never found. The house was strangely undisturbed in many areas. Whoever had committed this act knew the farm intimately, perhaps even lived there. Theories began to flood in, but no one had an answer. Had the killer been living with the Gruber family for years, hiding in plain sight? Was the murderer someone who knew the family intimately? Or had the killer been a complete stranger, waiting for the right moment to strike? One thing was for sure. The family had been brutally slaughtered, and their killer had walked among them for days after, undetected, living in the same house as the bodies of his victims. Whoever this killer was, he wasn't like the other murderers who had come before. This was a monster who reveled in his act of terror, who stayed in the shadows, even when the blood of his victims was still fresh on his hands. The horrific discovery at Hinterkaifeck shook the small village of Kaifeck to its very core. The Gruber family, once a staple of the quiet rural life, had been obliterated in a manner so brutal, so savage, that the very earth seemed to hold its breath in response. The killer had not only murdered them with chilling efficiency, but had stayed behind, living among the bodies of his victims for days, almost as if savoring the terror he had unleashed. The authorities were horrified, but with each passing hour, the mystery surrounding the murders grew darker, more twisted, and more incomprehensible. Who was capable of such cruelty, and why did they remain at the scene, undetected, for so long? As the first responders, local police officers and the village's doctor, entered the farmhouse, they were immediately struck by the unsettling normalcy that surrounded the gruesome crime scene. The house was eerily untouched. The murderer had taken no souvenirs, made no grand gestures. There were no dramatic signs of a violent struggle. The windows and doors had been locked from the inside, the cattle and other livestock were tended to, and the killer had made use of the family's food, cooking meals and drinking from their wine. It was as though the killer had decided to become a ghost, slipping in and out of the house, unseen by the outside world. What kind of monster does this? It was a question that haunted the minds of the investigators who arrived at the scene, trying to make sense of the chaos. The first thing they noticed was the blood, a thick, almost suffocating presence in every room, splattered across walls, pooling on floors, staining furniture. The brutality of the murders was evident in the sheer violence that had been inflicted on each victim. The family members had been murdered one by one, with Andreas Gruber, the father, struck down first. But what was most unsettling was the methodical nature of the killings. The killer didn't rush. He didn't seem to be in a frenzy. Instead, he moved with a cold, calculated precision, each murder executed with terrifying efficiency. There was no chaos, no signs of desperation, just an eerie calmness that added another layer of horror to the crime. When police examined the bodies, they found that Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, had been struck in the head with a blunt object, likely an axe, as he lay in bed. But the others were not spared the same gruesome fate. Kazilia Gruber, his wife, had suffered a similar fate. She was found in a different room, her body similarly mutilated, a horrific reminder of the power the killer had wielded that night. Then came the children, young Kazilia, just a child of 7, and Joseph, a mere toddler, both brutally murdered in their sleep, their innocence stripped away with chilling efficiency. They had never had the chance to cry out, to escape. The killer had been there, had watched them as they slept, and had struck without mercy. But it was the murder of Maria Baumgartner, the maid, that would become the focus of the investigation. Maria had only recently started working at the farm, but she had no idea what horrors awaited her. Her body was found in her room, the violence of her murder almost a mirror of the others. Her fate was sealed when the killer entered her room and, with a single blow, ended her life. It was evident that the killer had gone from one victim to the next, methodically taking each life without the slightest hesitation. Despite the brutality of the killings, there was one major question that hung heavily in the air. How had the killer remained undetected? The farmhouse was isolated, surrounded by vast fields and dense forests, far from the eyes of any nearby neighbors. But it wasn't the distance that baffled the investigators. It was the lack of sound. There had been no cries, no screams. The Grubers lived in a rural area, but surely the screams of 5 people being murdered would have been heard? How could this killer have come and gone without anyone noticing? The police began their investigation, trying to piece together the puzzle of what had transpired. But there were no easy answers. The first clue they found was the strange tracks in the snow that led to the farmhouse. These tracks were discovered leading from the forest to the house, and they seemed to indicate that someone had approached the farmhouse on foot. But the tracks were puzzling. They stopped at the house, and there were no footprints leading away. It was as though the killer had simply disappeared after committing the murders, leaving behind nothing but questions. In the following days, the investigators began to examine the farmhouse with increasing scrutiny. They searched the walls, the attic, the basement, every corner, every crevice, looking for any clue that might lead them to the killer. And then they found something. A strange set of keys was discovered in the house. These keys didn't match any of the locks in the house, and the investigators believed they could be the key to solving the crime. No pun intended. The keys were believed to be connected to an unknown person, someone who had access to the farm but was not a part of the Gruber family. As the investigation unfolded, more disturbing details began to emerge. The Grubers had experienced strange occurrences in the weeks leading up to the massacre. Andreas Gruber had mentioned to his neighbors that he had found footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the house, but he could never figure out who they belonged to. He had also reported hearing strange noises coming from the attic, sounds of something or someone moving about in the space above them. He even claimed to have heard voices in the house when no one else was around. Yet, despite these eerie occurrences, no one had thought to investigate further. And then there was the most chilling aspect of the case. The killer had stayed in the house for several days after the murders. For a period of 3 days, the killer had lived in the house with the dead bodies of the Gruber family, tending to their animals, eating their food, and using their belongings. This was not a rushed killing spree. This was something much more sinister, a slow, deliberate act of terror. The killer had observed their routine, blended in with the remnants of their lives, and walked among the dead, leaving behind no clue as to who he was or why he had committed the murders. The chilling fact that the killer had remained undetected for so long was enough to rattle even the most experienced detectives. The police were baffled. Every lead seemed to lead to a dead end. No witnesses had seen anything unusual, and no one had heard anything. The people of Kafek were left in a state of terror, wondering how anyone could have been so close to them, so hidden in plain sight. But it wasn't just the mystery of the killer's identity that haunted the community. It was the bizarre details surrounding the murder. Why had the killer returned to the house after committing such a brutal crime? Why had he stayed for days, interacting with the environment, eating food, and using the family's belongings? And why had he left so few traces of his presence? Was this the work of a stranger, a maniacal, cold-blooded killer? Or was it someone from within the family's circle? Someone who knew the farm and its inhabitants intimately? Someone who could hide in plain sight and remain undetected for days? Theories began to swirl in the community. Some whispered that the murders were the work of a family member, perhaps someone who had grown bitter and jealous of the Grubers. Others speculated that the killer had been hiding in the attic for days before carrying out the murders, living off the farm's resources and waiting for the right moment to strike. There were even those who whispered about supernatural forces, wondering if the house was haunted by something darker, something that had driven the killer to commit such atrocities. But no matter the theory, one thing was certain. The Hinterkaifeck murders were not like any other crime. They were brutal, mysterious, and deeply unsettling in a way that seemed to defy logic. The Hinterkaifeck murders had already consumed the small village of Kaifeck, leaving a wave of fear and confusion that was impossible to contain. No one felt safe, no one trusted their neighbors, and the very fabric of the community began to unravel. The Gruber family had been slaughtered in such a brutal, methodical manner that the police, the local investigators, and even the villagers found themselves haunted by a question that refused to die. Who could have done this? And why? The grisly details of the murders were shocking, but what truly chilled the investigators to their core was the eerie silence that enveloped the aftermath. The killer hadn't just committed a senseless act of violence and fled. No, he had remained in the farmhouse, eating their food, tending their animals, and even using the family's belongings. For 3 whole days, the killer had lived among the dead. The implications of this were staggering. It suggested a level of control, of calculated coldness, that was far beyond the scope of a typical killer. It made the case one of the most sinister, perplexing, and unnerving mysteries to ever haunt the annals of criminal history. The authorities could find no answers. No signs of forced entry, no identifiable footprints, no fingerprints, and no murder weapon. How could someone have slaughtered 5 people so brutally and yet left so little behind? There were no traces of an external struggle, no broken windows, no signs of forced doors. It was as though the killer had slipped into the very bones of the farm, as though he was a ghost moving unnoticed in the shadows. But even as the investigation grew colder, something even more disturbing began to take shape. Theories and suspicions began to emerge. Dark whispers in the village about the Gruber family's secretive nature, about strange occurrences in the weeks leading up to the murders, and even about an old, lingering curse that some believed haunted the farm. As the villagers discussed their suspicions, one thing became painfully clear. This was no ordinary crime. The nature of the killings, the aftermath, and the lack of concrete evidence made it feel like a puzzle that was deliberately out of reach, as if someone or something was ensuring that the truth would never be uncovered. In the weeks following the discovery of the murders, the police scoured every inch of the farm, trying to piece together the events leading up to that night. The killer's trail was virtually non-existent, save for a few suspicious footprints in the snow and strange, unexplained noises that had been reported by Andreas Gruber before the murders. He had often claimed to have heard noises in the attic and had even mentioned finding footprints in the snow leading to his farmhouse, but they always seemed to disappear without a trace. Had the killer been hiding there, perhaps living inside the house, silently watching them for days before committing the murders? One of the most perplexing aspects of the case was the strange set of keys that had been discovered during the investigation. They didn't seem to match any of the locks in the house, leading investigators to believe that someone outside the family had access to the farm. This was particularly disturbing, as it suggested that the killer either had intimate knowledge of the Gruber family's routines, or, even more chillingly, that the killer had been part of the family's life all along. Someone who could move in and out of their home undetected. There were whispers in the village of a possible family connection. Had someone within the Gruber household turned on the family in a violent outburst? Could the killer have been someone who knew the farm intimately, perhaps even a family member or someone with a close relationship to the Grubers? This theory gained traction, especially given the isolated nature of the farm and the strange incidents that had preceded the murders. For instance, it was revealed that Victoria Gruber, the daughter, had been living with a dark secret. Some claimed that she had been involved in an incestuous relationship with her father, Andreas Gruber, something that had been whispered about in the village for years. Was it possible that Andreas's dark, twisted actions had led to a violent eruption of anger and revenge? Was Victoria, or perhaps another member of the family, seeking to end the cycle of abuse in a fit of rage? This theory was compounded by the disturbing fact that Victoria's children, who were murdered along with her, had been bludgeoned in their sleep, their small bodies left mutilated in a way that suggested a profound hatred, or perhaps a deep, unresolved pain. But the theory of incest, while disturbing, had no real proof to back it up, and the questions it raised only made the investigation more tangled, more uncertain. As the months dragged on with few leads, another disturbing development came to light: the farm's remaining livestock. The animals, Cattle, horses, and chickens had been cared for during the time after the murders, but no one had seen who was taking care of them. The killer had tended to the farm's animals, ensuring that they remained alive and well, as though nothing had happened. This chilling fact only deepened the mystery. Why had the killer stayed? Why had he continued living in the same house, surrounded by the blood of his victims, undetected by anyone? For 3 days, the killer had lived in the house as if it were his own. He ate the family's food, made use of their bedding, and even went so far as to care for the livestock. Actions that suggested that, whoever he was familiar with the Gruber family's daily routines. This was not a random act of violence. It was something far more calculated and sinister. The killer wasn't just after revenge. He was living out a twisted, unholy fantasy. One that involved not just murder, but a prolonged, sickening dominance over the family. Perhaps even more unsettling than the killer's actions was the fact that no one in the village had seen anything unusual. The Hinterkaifeck farm was isolated, but it wasn't as if it was completely out of sight. People passed by on their way to the town, yet no one had ever heard anything strange. There were no accounts of suspicious activity, no whispers of someone new in the area. How had the killer remained so close to the village, so close to everyone, and yet never been detected? As the investigation wore on, new theories began to emerge, each darker and more perplexing than the last. One of the most chilling involved the possibility that the killer had been hiding in the attic for days, observing the family and waiting for the right moment to strike. It was speculated that the killer had been living in the house for weeks, possibly even longer, hidden in the attic, making himself virtually undetectable to the family. Some even began to wonder if the killer was someone the family trusted, someone who could hide in plain sight. Could the killer have been someone close to the family? Someone who had been helping on the farm? Perhaps a neighbor, or even someone from the family's past with a deep grudge against them? Was there a deep secret at the heart of the family? A motive that drove the killer to commit such a horrific act? Other theories suggested that the murders were connected to an old, lingering curse that had plagued the farm for generations. Was there something supernatural at play? Was the Gruber family's history steeped in bloodshed and violence that had finally come to a head? While most dismissed this as superstitious nonsense, there was no denying that the events surrounding the murders felt too strange, too otherworldly, to be explained away so easily. The coldness of the killings, the fact that the killer stayed behind to tend to the farm, the silence in which the murders occurred. It all felt like something from a nightmare, a story that was too unreal to be true. As the investigation continued to stall, the village of Kaifeck became more and more consumed by fear. Who could trust anyone anymore? How could anyone be sure that the person they spoke to each day was not capable of such horrors? The idea that the killer might still be living in the village, hiding in plain sight, made people look over their shoulders at every turn. The Hinterkaifeck murders, which had gripped the small village of Kaifeck and Germany at large, seemed to have no end, no clear conclusion. The questions that arose after the horrific massacre of 5 people on that isolated farm remained unanswered, gnawing at the minds of the villagers and investigators for years. The police had exhausted every lead, pursued every theory, and combed through every inch of the Gruber family's farmhouse. But still, the killer slipped through their grasp. Who could have done this? And more chillingly, why had they done it? As the investigation continued to stall, rumors and suspicions grew. With no concrete evidence, the case remained unsolved, leaving everyone involved with a sense of unease, as if a shadow was cast over the entire village. What was most unsettling was not just the brutality of the murders or the absence of a clear motive, but the eerie silence that continued to surround the aftermath. The killer had never been caught. The years passed, but the fear never dissipated. The village of Kaifeck had been forever scarred. The few clues that the police had gathered after the murders led nowhere. The footprints in the snow were the only tangible trace of someone entering or leaving the house. But these tracks had been inconclusive, leading to the farm, then vanishing without a trace. No one had ever seen anything strange around the property in the days before the murders. No one had witnessed anyone suspicious, and the tracks led nowhere, disappearing in the dense forest surrounding the farm. The strange set of keys found in the house only deepened the mystery. These keys did not match any of the locks in the farmhouse, leading investigators to believe that the killer had to be someone with inside knowledge of the Gruber family's routine. The theory that the killer had been living in the house, perhaps hiding in the attic, seemed plausible, but it was still speculative. Despite a thorough search of the entire property, no one was able to find a hiding place that seemed to fit someone living in the attic or elsewhere undetected. Moreover, the killer's methodical approach, slaughtering each member of the family in their sleep and then going about his business for days afterward, left an air of calculated coldness. The killer had tended to the animals, eaten the family's food, and used their belongings with unnerving familiarity. Whoever had committed this crime knew the family well, but there were still no answers as to who that could be. Over time, the case began to grow colder. Theories emerged, but none seemed to fit all the pieces of the puzzle. There were whispers about the Gruber family's past, about hidden secrets that might have led to the murders. Andreas Gruber's strange behavior, especially the reports of hearing voices in the attic and discovering strange footprints in the snow, had raised suspicions long before the murders occurred. Had something supernatural been involved? Was the farm cursed, as some had suggested in hushed tones? Or was there a darker secret at play? A secret that, once uncovered, might explain the unimaginable horror that had unfolded? One of the most disturbing rumors that circulated after the murders was that Andreas Gruber's relationship with his daughter, Victoria, had been far from normal. Some even whispered that the relationship might have been incestuous, though there was no direct evidence to support these claims. Regardless, the tension in the family, the strange behaviors, and the isolation they lived in seemed to suggest that there were unresolved issues beneath the surface. Could this have led to a violent outburst of rage from one of the family members? But even this theory had no solid proof. What remained were only the fragmented pieces of the puzzle. The strange footprints, the keys, the reports of disturbing noises, and the insistence by some villagers that something evil had been lurking in the Gruber family home long before the massacre. Still, without a clear motive or suspect, the investigation slowly came to a halt. As the years passed, the whispers of the Hinterkaifeck murders began to fade into legend. The case remained unsolved, and the questions about the killer's identity lingered like an insidious cloud over the village. But even as time wore on, the true horror of what had happened was never forgotten. People who had known the Gruber family and those who lived in the area continued to feel the shadows of those murders hanging over them, and Kaifeck became known not just as a place of death, but as a place of haunted silence. The chilling fact remained: the killer had never been caught. The police had no idea who he was, where he came from, or what motivated him to carry out such brutal, methodical murders. Had he been someone who had lived with the Grubers? Had he been someone who knew the family intimately, someone who had been hiding in the house? The chilling fact that no one had seen anything unusual made it seem as though the killer had been a ghost, slipping in and out of the farm without ever leaving a trace. Some villagers speculated that the killer had known the family for years. Perhaps he had been a worker on the farm, someone who had worked for the Grubers in the past and had become bitter over some perceived wrong. Had the killer been a close family friend, someone with deep knowledge of the Grubers' routines? Or, as some locals feared, had the killer been someone even closer, a family member who had been hiding his dark nature all along? The possibility of an inside job became more plausible as the investigation turned up nothing concrete, and the police had no choice but to entertain this theory. However, no one was ever charged. The investigation went on for years, but the killer's identity remained a ghost, elusive and intangible, as though he were somehow beyond the reach of law and logic. The case remained open for many years, but it eventually became a cold case, filed away in the forgotten corners of criminal history. Some years later, the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders took on a life of its own. It became a part of the fabric of German folklore. The Gruber family's tragic end was discussed with a mix of horror and fascination, and the story was told over and over again by generations who grew up hearing of the farm that was now said to be cursed. Strangely enough, the land itself was never developed. The farmstead of Hinterkaifeck, once home to a family that had worked and lived there for generations, was left abandoned. Over time, the house fell into disrepair, its walls decaying, its windows shattered by time. The eerie air that hung around it, even after the murders, kept the land vacant. Rumors spread that the farm was haunted, that the spirits of the Gruber family, or worse, the killer himself, still roamed the land. In 1923, just a year after the murders, the land was abandoned for good. The farmhouse remained a silent tomb, and its dark history loomed over the surrounding area like a curse. Over the years, the site has been visited by curious tourists and dark-seeking thrill-seekers hoping to uncover the truth. Some claim to have seen strange figures in the windows or heard unexplained sounds from the house at night, though none of these claims could ever be substantiated. But still, the legend persisted. In the end, the Hinterkaifeck murders are a story without a conclusion, a mystery that remains unsolved. No one knows who the killer was, what his motive was, or how he was able to carry out such a horrific act with no trace left behind. The brutality of the murders, the calculated nature of the killings, the eerie silence that surrounded them, will haunt the minds of anyone who learns about the case. Was it the act of a deranged stranger? A family member hiding in the walls of the farm? Or something more sinister? A curse or a twisted tale of vengeance? The answers, unfortunately, remain out of reach. As the years have passed, the case has become less about solving a crime and more about understanding the unimaginable. The horror of a murder so cold, so inexplicable, that it continues to send a chill down the spine of those who seek to understand it. The truth may never come to light. The identity of the killer may remain a shadow, hidden in the cracks of time. But for the village of Kaifeck, the darkness of the Hinterkaifeck murders remains a ghost that lingers, forever untouched by the light of justice. The farm stands as a haunted monument to the terrible mystery, its walls whispering the unanswered question that has plagued so many. Who was the killer of Hinterkaifeck? If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3, the Amityville Murders. On a quiet night in the suburban town of Amityville, New York, the DeFeo family, 6 lives, bound by blood, were slaughtered in a manner so brutal, so unimaginable, that the world would never be the same again. The house, once full of laughter and life, now stood as a silent witness to one of the most horrific and chilling massacres in American history. Ronald DeFeo Jr., a young man who was once a son, a brother, and a part of this family, became the monster lurking in the darkness of his own home. In a matter of hours, he would extinguish the lives of his mother, father, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters. But the brutality of the murders, the savage cruelty with which he carried out the killings, would only be the beginning of the nightmare that would haunt Amityville forever. The massacre would spark suspicion, horror, and disbelief, and ignite the imagination of the world, leading to a trail of chilling stories, countless investigations, and even haunting horror films that would blur the lines between fact and fiction. What drove a young man to commit such violence? Was it the influence of the house itself, rumored to be haunted? Or was it something far darker? A family torn apart by secrets, addictions, and an insatiable rage. The answers would forever remain elusive, buried beneath layers of mystery and fear. But one thing was certain: the DeFeo murders were just the beginning. The Amityville horror had only begun to unfold. It was the night that would cast a long, dark shadow over Amityville, New York. A night when the quiet, leafy suburban town would transform into the setting for one of the most gruesome and chilling murders the world would ever know. The DeFeo family, once ordinary, would become victims of an unimaginable horror, and their house would become a haunting monument to a tragedy that would spark stories for generations to come. But it wasn't just a house. No, it was a place where blood would spill, where lives would end in darkness, and where the echoes of the victims would forever linger in the walls. The DeFeos lived in a beautiful, 2-story home at 112 Ocean Avenue, a modest house with white siding, dark green shutters, and a welcoming front porch. To outsiders, it seemed like any other family home. But beneath the picture of tranquility, things were unraveling. Ronald DeFeo Jr., the eldest son of the family, had become more and more erratic in the months leading up to the massacre. He was known for his volatile temper, his deep-seated anger, and a growing darkness that seemed to consume him. His actions had become unpredictable, violent at times, self-destructive at others, and the family was growing increasingly uneasy in the shadow of his rage. But no one could have foreseen the horror that was about to unfold. It was November 13th, 1974, a Tuesday night like any other. The DeFeo family had settled in for the evening. Ronald Sr., the father, was in his room with his wife, Louise, and their 5 children were scattered throughout the house. Ronald Jr., the oldest, was alone in his room. But in the dead of night, something would snap. The air was heavy, thick with the kind of tension that only preceded unimaginable violence. There was no warning, no screams, no sign that anyone was in danger. The family, in their beds, were completely unaware of the terror creeping closer. Ronald DeFeo Jr., armed with a .35 caliber rifle, silently moved through the house. His anger had reached a boiling point. His resentment, frustration, and rage had built up to a climax that could no longer be contained. He began with his father, Ronald Sr., who was asleep in his bed. A single shot rang out, hitting Ronald Sr. in the back, causing him to collapse instantly. The gunshot, loud and jarring, echoed through the house, but it didn't wake the family. Ronald Jr., methodical and calm, moved on to the next victim. He turned to his mother, Louise. She was lying beside his father, unaware of what was happening. With a cold, almost detached precision, he fired again. This time, the bullet struck his mother in the head. She never had a chance to scream. She simply fell lifeless beside the man she had been married to for years. In his rage, Ronald Jr. then moved through the house, methodically killing each member of his family. John, the eldest of the younger children, and Mark, the next oldest, were executed in their beds, shot with the same brutal efficiency. The rifle barked again and again, loud, thunderous shots, each one signaling the end of a life. But it wasn't just the boys. His younger sisters, Allison and Deirdre, lay helpless in their beds. The killer showed no mercy. He executed them both without hesitation. The chaos of those moments must have been horrific, the air thick with the sound of gunshots and the silence of death. There were no cries, no last words, just the cold, unfeeling force of death, brought by the hands of someone who had once been part of the family. Once the killing spree was over, Ronald Jr. took his time. He didn't flee. He didn't run to hide. Instead, he sat with the bodies of his family, perhaps in disbelief at what he had just done. He knew that he had crossed a line from which there was no return, and yet there was no fear, no panic. Instead, there was a strange calm, a sense of finality. He had already taken the lives of the people closest to him, and now there was nothing left to fear. The worst had been done, and yet the true horror of the night hadn't even begun. Ronald Jr. didn't leave the house immediately. Instead, he spent hours inside, in a twisted version of calm. The house, once full of life, now stood silent, with the cold bodies of the family scattered throughout the rooms. It was as if time itself had come to a standstill. The morning sun would come, but it would shine down on a place forever marked by darkness. At first light, something was amiss. Ronald DeFeo Jr., covered in blood, went to the local bar where he had frequented for years. He was clearly disheveled and distressed, as though he had just emerged from a nightmare. He made a strange statement to his friends. "You have to help me. My parents are dead." No one, not even the most suspicious of his acquaintances, could have imagined the horrors he was about to reveal. The authorities were quickly alerted, and when they arrived at the house, they were confronted by a scene of unthinkable horror. Inside, the DeFeo family lay lifeless, their bodies sprawled in various positions, as though they had been caught off guard. Each person had been shot at close range, some multiple times. It was clear that the killings had been brutal and swift, and there was no sign of struggle, no attempt to flee. What was even more disturbing was the absence of any signs of forced entry. The doors were locked from the inside. There was no indication of a break-in, no signs of struggle in the house. How had someone been able to carry out such a massacre without alerting anyone? How had Ronald Jr. escaped detection for so long? What had driven him to commit such an act? The police, struggling to make sense of the crime scene, questioned Ronald Jr., and it didn't take long for them to begin piecing together the horror. But Ronald's behavior was strange. There was a lack of emotion, an eerie calmness to his answers. His lack of remorse, his nonchalant attitude, sent shivers down the spines of the investigators. But the truth was even darker than they could have imagined. Ronald Jr. was arrested and charged with the murders of his entire family. And in the days following the killings, a chilling story began to unfold. One that involved anger, rage, and possibly even paranoia. As Ronald Jr. sat in custody, questions began to mount. What could have driven him to murder his own family? What made a son turn on his mother, father, brothers, and sisters? The authorities dug deeper into his history. His relationships with his family, his troubled past, and the dark side of his personality that had slowly emerged in the years leading up to the killings. It was revealed that Ronald Jr. had a history of violent outbursts and had long been struggling with addiction, but even more disturbingly, there were whispers that the DeFeo family had been facing financial ruin. Ronald Sr. had been a man of questionable business dealings, and the DeFeos had accumulated a large amount of debt. Could financial stress, combined with a volatile home life, have pushed Ronald Jr. to the breaking point? In the days that followed, as the police conducted their investigation, the true depth of the darkness that had plagued the DeFeo family came to light. But the question remained, was Ronald Jr. simply a product of his environment? A young man shaped by a turbulent, toxic family dynamic? Or was something more insidious at play? The quiet, idyllic suburban neighborhood of Amityville, New York, would never be the same again. The tranquil streets, once bustling with the sounds of children playing and neighbors chatting, were now filled with a grim silence. The grisly murders of the DeFeo family had shaken the community to its core. The house that had once been filled with the noise of daily life was now a place of unimaginable death. The shocking brutality of the murders, and the fact that the killer was none other than Ronald DeFeo Jr., his own son, made the case even more chilling. The question that now plagued everyone's minds was simple, but maddening. Why? Ronald Jr.'s behavior after the killings seemed almost unreal. Disconnected, emotionless, and unervingly calm. How could he have done it? Was it an act of rage? A fit of madness? Or was there something more sinister at play? The lack of remorse that Ronald Jr. showed during his questioning became a terrifying red flag, one that would haunt the investigators as they worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. But the deeper they dug into his past, the darker the story became. The town of Amityville was already known for its suburban charm and family-oriented atmosphere. But after that night, whispers of evil, darkness, and hauntings began to surface. The massacre would not only go on to be one of the most brutal killings in the state's history, but it would also become the beginning of a chilling tale that would inspire a legend, the story of the Amityville Horror. What had started as a family tragedy would soon morph into something far larger, something that would echo for decades to come. As Ronald DeFeo Jr. sat in a holding cell, waiting for the charges to be filed against him, the authorities were still piecing together the horrific details of the crime. The questions surrounding the murders were as haunting as the deaths themselves. How could a son kill his entire family? Was it premeditated, or did something snap inside him in the heat of the moment? Despite the emotional numbness that Ronald Jr. displayed, his arrest and eventual confession set the stage for a chilling investigation. What was even more bizarre was the disconnected calmness with which Ronald Jr. spoke about the killings. It was as if he had done something mundane, as though the act of murdering his family was no more than another errand in a list of daily tasks. The night of November 13th, 1974, had begun as an ordinary evening. Yet, in a matter of hours, the DeFeo house would be turned into a horrifying crime scene, with 6 lifeless bodies scattered throughout the rooms. When Ronald Jr. confessed to the murders, his story was unsettlingly matter-of-fact. He described how he had grabbed the rifle from a cabinet, walked through the house, and shot each member of the family while they slept. He said the gunshots hadn't even awakened them. It was like the whole family had been too unaware, too vulnerable to fight back. One of the most chilling parts of his confession came when he described the sheer methodical nature of the killings. He had not rushed. He had not panicked. He didn't flee the scene afterward, but instead spent hours in the house with his family's corpses, as if he was waiting for something. For the first time, he explained that there was no psychotic rage, no out-of-control bloodlust. It was as if he was carrying out a cold, calculated mission, one that, for reasons unknown, was necessary. But no matter how he explained it, the brutality of his actions could not be justified. The police were puzzled. Why did he wait after the murders? Why not flee? Why had he sat in that house for hours, surrounded by the bodies of his family, unmoved by the carnage he had wrought? Did he believe his family's deaths were justified, or had something more sinister been at play? The answers were unclear, and Ronald Jr.'s confession was only the beginning of a story that would continue to spiral into the unknown. As investigators delved into the details of Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s life, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Ronald Jr. wasn't just the troubled son of a seemingly normal family. His background revealed a series of issues that were both personal and deeply ingrained in the family's troubled history. He had been a difficult child, one prone to violent outbursts and tantrums. Over the years, his relationship with his father, Ronald Sr., had been deteriorating. The father-son relationship was toxic, filled with anger, resentment, and unresolved conflicts. But what lay beneath the surface? Was it just family dysfunction, or was there something darker, something more sinister at play? As the authorities pieced together Ronald Jr.'s history, they discovered that he had been struggling with substance abuse, mainly alcohol and drugs. His erratic behavior was not a new development, but something that had been festering for years. It seemed that Ronald Jr. had always been on the edge, teetering between moments of emotional instability and bursts of violence. He was a young man full of rage, and it was clear that his family had become the targets of that rage. What drove him to this breaking point? The investigators believed it was more than just drugs or anger. They began to wonder if the DeFeo family's financial troubles had contributed to the eruption of violence. Ronald Sr. had been struggling with debts and had been overwhelmed by financial pressures in the months leading up to the murders. Was it possible that Ronald Jr. had killed his family as an act of desperation? An attempt to escape the mounting pressure, to take control of the situation in the only way he knew how? Was this simply the act of a man pushed to the edge by his father's influence and a life he could no longer bear? But even more disturbing than the financial issues was the idea that Ronald Jr. had been living in a house that was plagued with dark energy. There were whispers that the house at 112 Ocean Avenue was haunted, that there were evil forces at work within its walls. Many who knew the DeFeos spoke of strange occurrences, noises, footsteps, and an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to grow heavier over time. Was it possible that the house had somehow driven Ronald Jr. to madness? Had he been influenced by the spirit of something darker that lurked within the walls of their home? As investigators continued to uncover the details of Ronald Jr.'s troubled life, they began to entertain the idea that perhaps the Amityville house itself had played a role in the murders. The evil energy that surrounded the DeFeos' home became part of the mythology of the case. Was it possible that the house had become a breeding ground for madness? Something that had twisted the minds of its inhabitants and pushed Ronald Jr. to murder? The rumors of supernatural forces, voices in the night, and strange happenings began to swirl, and they would only grow stronger as time went on. Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s trial began in 1975, just months after the murders. The case was one of the most sensational in recent history, drawing widespread media attention. The details of the murders were shocking, but it was Ronald Jr.'s cold demeanor during the investigation and trial that captivated the public. He had no remorse, no signs of guilt, and showed little emotion throughout the proceedings. His calmness was both unsettling and fascinating. In his defense, Ronald Jr. claimed that he was influenced by voices that had come from inside his head, urging him to kill. He stated that the voices had told him that his family was plotting against him, that they were going to kill him first. Ronald Jr. was quickly diagnosed with schizophrenia, and his defense attorneys argued that he was not in control of his actions when he murdered his family. The defense painted a picture of a maniacal mind, a man driven by paranoia, delusions, and voices from within that controlled him. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. They argued that Ronald Jr. had been lucid and aware of his actions, that he had acted out of sheer anger and selfishness, not from a mental disorder. The prosecution's case relied on the idea that Ronald Jr. had calculated and coldly executed the murders. The lack of panic, the methodical nature of the killings, and the fact that he had stayed in the house for hours afterward all pointed to a deliberate act of violence, not a crime of passion or mental illness. The jury was left to decide whether Ronald Jr. was insane at the time of the killings or whether he was a cold-blooded murderer. After a lengthy trial, Ronald DeFeo Jr. was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. As Ronald Jr. served his sentence, the DeFeo murders continued to haunt the town of Amityville, as well as the world at large. But the story didn't end with the conviction of the killer. In the years following the murders, the house itself would become a legend, attracting attention from horror fans, paranormal investigators, and curious thrill-seekers. The Amityville Horror, as it came to be known, became a cultural phenomenon, a tale of ghosts, hauntings, and the curse of the DeFeo home. But the truth, as always, was more complicated. The Amityville murders were a tale of a family torn apart by a mix of rage, addiction, and financial ruin. And, in the end, Ronald DeFeo Jr. became a symbol of the dark, twisted legacy of a family's destruction. One that would echo in the minds of those who dared to ask, what drives a son to murder his own family? The conviction of Ronald DeFeo Jr. did little to quell the growing sense of dread that had settled over 112 Ocean Avenue, the house that would forever be tied to one of the most brutal family massacres in American history. The story of the DeFeo murders, 6 members of the DeFeo family slaughtered in their own beds by the hands of their eldest son, was just the beginning. But in the wake of the crime, a darker chapter was about to unfold, one that would turn the DeFeo house from a place of unimaginable violence to a living nightmare. While Ronald Jr. sat in prison, serving his sentence for the murders, the house, once a home, became the focal point of a horrific and enduring legend. The grisly events of that fateful night in 1974 would go on to spark a wave of horror stories, rumors, and terrifying accounts that would consume the imagination of the public. But the question remained, was the house truly haunted? Or had the grisly murders become so ingrained in the town's collective consciousness that people began to see ghosts in the shadows? It wasn't long before the Amityville house gained national attention, not only because of the heinous murders that had taken place within its walls, but because of the stories that emerged after the DeFeos were gone. Strange, terrifying occurrences began to surface almost immediately after the killings, and the house would soon become notorious for its alleged supernatural activity. In December of 1975, just over a year after the DeFeo murders, the Lutz family moved into the house at 112 Ocean Avenue, eager to start a new chapter in their lives. George and Kathy Lutz, along with their 3 children, were unaware of the house's tragic history when they purchased it. The Lutz family was described as a normal, middle-class family, looking for a fresh start in a quiet suburban neighborhood. But little did they know that they were about to step into the very heart of a terrifying nightmare. The family's arrival at the house seemed like the beginning of an ordinary move into a new home. But almost immediately, they began to notice strange, disturbing phenomena. It started small, almost innocuous. Unexplained cold spots, a feeling of being watched, doors that wouldn't stay shut, and lights that flickered for no reason. But these occurrences would soon escalate into something far darker, something far more sinister. The Lutzes were also quickly struck by a sense of unease that seemed to permeate the house. George, in particular, began to experience extreme mood swings and a sense of overwhelming dread. At night, he reported feeling as though something was watching him from the darkness. His behavior became erratic, and Kathy noticed him becoming increasingly agitated, even violent at times. He began to wake up at 3:15 a.m. every night, the same time the DeFeo family had been murdered. This was the first sign of a disturbing pattern that would only get worse. As days passed, the paranormal activity in the house grew more intense. The Lutzes reported swarming flies, despite the fact that it was winter and there were no decomposing bodies nearby. Strange odors began to seep through the rooms, smells of something rotten, decaying, as though the house itself was exuding death. The house seemed alive with its own malevolent energy. It was as if the very walls were bleeding the memories of the tragic murders into the air, suffocating the family with its ghosts. The Lutz children weren't immune to the terror either. One of the most disturbing reports was that of a priest who visited the house to bless it. Father Mancuso, a local priest, was called by the Lutzes to help cleanse the house of its evil presence. But his experience was nothing short of terrifying. He reported being slapped by an unseen force and hearing a voice telling him to get out. After that, he refused to return to the house. The fact that a priest, one who had dedicated his life to confronting evil, was frightened enough to abandon the house only added fuel to the growing legend of the Amityville Horror. The most chilling experiences were not just limited to strange noises, sights, or smells. George Lutz, the father, began to undergo a horrifying transformation. As the weeks went on, he became increasingly obsessed with the house, its dark history, and the powerful forces that seemed to be consuming him. He described feeling a pull, almost like a compulsion, to do something terrible. His rage, already existing in a subtle form, grew more intense. He became obsessed with the house's need to feed on negative energy, and he found himself drawn into the very darkness that had overtaken Ronald DeFeo Jr. years before. George began to lock himself in the basement, and would later recount how he was overcome with an intense, almost animalistic rage. He began to act in ways that seemed unfamiliar to his family, as though he was being controlled by something otherworldly. George became more withdrawn, consumed with an obsession for the house that drove him to neglect his family. The house had become a prison, not just for the family's physical bodies, but for their minds, distorting them into something unrecognizable. Kathy, too, began to feel the house's power over her. She had vivid nightmares and often found herself in a trance-like state, losing track of time and space. Her children, particularly the youngest, began to experience terrifying visions of dark figures, demonic presences, and other horrifying images. One of the children even claimed to have seen a large, glowing red-eyed figure in the hallway. The line between the living and the dead seemed to blur, and the family was no longer in control of their own lives. By the time the Lutzes had lived in the house for 28 days, they were desperate to escape. The once peaceful suburban family was now at the brink of collapse. Their physical and mental health had deteriorated to a point where they could no longer endure the paranormal torment they were experiencing. They fled the house in the middle of the night, leaving behind all their possessions. Their brief time in the house had been marked by screaming in the night, uncontrollable fear, and the feeling that they were being driven to the brink of madness. Despite the terror they had endured, the Lutzes were still drawn into the story of the house. They couldn't escape the attention that was now focused on them, especially after they went public with their experiences. They had lived through something terrifying, something that shattered their lives. The house had marked them in ways they would never be able to escape. As the Lutzes fled the house, their story quickly gained attention. News outlets jumped on the sensational tale, reporting on the ghosts, the dark forces, and the supernatural activity that had plagued the family during their short stay. It wasn't long before book deals and film adaptations followed. The Amityville Horror became an international sensation, its roots planted in the grisly DeFeo murders, but its legacy would soon take on a life of its own. The Lutzes' account was adapted into a best-selling book, which was later turned into a movie franchise that spanned decades. The house, once a place of death, had now become the backdrop for one of the most enduring horror legends of all time. The Amityville Horror had transformed from a real-life tragedy to a story woven into the fabric of American folklore. But the question remained: what was real, and what had been embellished for dramatic effect? Some argued that the Lutzes had fabricated their experiences, perhaps in an effort to capitalize on the story of the DeFeo murders. Others believed that the supernatural forces within the house were far too strong to ignore. Was the house truly haunted? Or had the tragedy of the DeFeo murders created an emotional and psychological atmosphere so thick with tension that it became a breeding ground for fear? To this day, the mystery of the Amityville Horror continues to fascinate. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue, once a home filled with laughter, became a place of death and terror, and is now a symbol of both human tragedy and the supernatural. Was the house haunted by the ghosts of the DeFeo family, whose brutal deaths still seem to echo through the halls? Or was it simply the result of the intense emotional and psychological stress that had been created by the brutal murders, compounded by the Lutz family's fears and imaginations? Whatever the truth, the legacy of the Amityville Horror remains as powerful as ever. The house stands as a chilling reminder of what happens when violence and darkness come together to create a legacy that will haunt both the living and the dead for years to come. The Lutzes may have escaped, but their story, like the house itself, will never truly be free. As the years passed, the legacy of the Amityville Horror continued to evolve. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue had gone from a tragic crime scene to a center of supernatural terror, and then, eventually, a cultural phenomenon. The Lutz family had fled, leaving behind a house filled with dark memories, but the haunting specter of what had happened within its walls would never fade. The real question had become, was the house truly cursed, or had the tragedies that transpired within its walls set off a chain reaction of psychological torment that spiraled beyond anyone's control? The Amityville Horror had captured the imaginations of millions, but for those who lived through it, the nightmare was far from over. For the Lutz family, fleeing the house was only the beginning of their personal torment, as their connection to the house became an inescapable part of their lives. As rumors, stories, and ghostly theories swirled around the house, the Lutzes found themselves trapped in a tangled web of media attention, suspicion, and unanswered questions. Was it possible that they had fabricated their experiences, or had they been victims of forces far beyond their understanding? But the story of the Amityville house did not end with the Lutz family. In fact, it would only gain strength from their departure, as new occupants, investigators, and even paranormal teams ventured into the house, each of them hoping to uncover the truth behind the terrifying events that had unfolded. What they found, or thought they found, would leave them haunted in ways they could never have predicted. After the Lutzes left in a hurry, the house at 112 Ocean Avenue sat empty for some time. It wasn't long, however, before a new family moved in. The Sublette family, who were not aware of the horrors the house had witnessed, took up residence in the infamous home. In stark contrast to the Lutzes' dramatic departure, the Sublettes initially seemed unaffected by any supernatural occurrences. For a brief period, it appeared that the house's dark history had finally been put to rest. But as the weeks went on, the paranormal activity that had plagued the Lutz family began to surface once again. The same eerie phenomena: cold spots, odd sounds, and a general sense of unease began to manifest. The Sublettes, though initially skeptical, soon reported strange experiences that eerily mirrored those of the Lutz family. The house seemed to be alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy that they could not escape. Strange, inexplicable events began to occur. Items moved by themselves, lights flickered, and even the children claimed to see strange figures. At first, the family dismissed these occurrences as coincidental or the product of their own imaginations. But as the phenomena grew more intense and frequent, they found themselves trapped in a cycle of unease and fear. Despite the eeriness of their experiences, the Sublettes were determined to stay, refusing to let the house's past dictate their lives. However, after a series of increasingly disturbing incidents, including unexplained physical symptoms that seemed to affect their health, the Sublettes eventually left, leaving the house once again empty, but never quiet. As the years passed, the Amityville house continued to capture the attention of paranormal investigators. The notorious house, now drenched in its dark history, became the focus of numerous investigations, each one hoping to uncover the truth behind the terrifying events. The most notable investigation took place in 1976, just a year after the Lutz family fled. A team of paranormal researchers, including Ed and Lorraine Warren, the famous demonologists, visited the house in an attempt to understand the true nature of the haunting. The Warrens, known for their involvement in some of the most famous cases in paranormal history, including the Enfield poltergeist and the Annabelle doll, quickly declared the house to be haunted, possessed by dark forces that seemed to be feeding off the negative energy left behind by the murders of the DeFeo family. The Warrens reported feeling overwhelmed by the oppressive atmosphere, describing it as a house that was filled with an almost tangible evil. In particular, Ed Warren, known for his no-nonsense approach to hauntings, spoke of feeling a malevolent force in the house that seemed to physically drain him of energy. Lorraine Warren, a psychic medium, claimed to have seen visions of spirits and even reported feeling a demonic presence that she described as the embodiment of pure evil. The Warrens, along with their team, conducted exorcism rituals to cleanse the house, but their work was far from successful. Their visit only added fuel to the fire, and the house's reputation as a place of supernatural terror continued to grow. The events during the investigation were so disturbing that the Warrens later spoke about their time in the house, emphasizing the powerful and terrifying force that they believed resided there. They confirmed that they were not dealing with simple ghosts or spirits, but something much more sinister, a dark entity that could manipulate and control those within its reach. As the story of the Amityville house continued to capture the public's imagination, its haunting legacy was cemented by the release of a book in 1977, The Amityville Horror, A True Story, written by Jay Anson. The book chronicled the terrifying experiences of the Lutz family and became an instant bestseller. The book painted a vivid picture of the horrors the Lutz family experienced, from the voices and apparitions to the malignant force that seemed to push George Lutz to the brink of insanity. The publication of the book sent shockwaves through the public. It became a cultural phenomenon, and interest in the house surged. The terrifying descriptions in the book stirred up fear and curiosity, making the Amityville house a must-visit location for anyone with an interest in the supernatural. Shortly after the book's release, a movie adaptation was made in 1979. The film, The Amityville Horror, became a massive success, further solidifying the house's place in pop culture as one of the most haunted places on Earth. The movie, though dramatized for cinematic effect, made the story of the Lutz family's ordeal even more vivid for audiences, and it became a horror classic that is still revered today. The house, though no longer occupied by the Lutz family, became synonymous with terror and horror, an enduring image of dread. But even as the media frenzy continued, the question remained: was the Amityville house truly haunted, or was it merely a product of the imagination? A house with a tragic past that had been distorted into something far more frightening? In the years that followed, the house at 112 Ocean Avenue changed owners several times. Each new family that moved into the house seemed to have their own strange experiences. Some reported feelings of unease, while others insisted that the house was perfectly normal. But no matter who moved in, the legacy of the DeFeo murders, coupled with the intense public attention from the Lutzes and paranormal investigators, would never leave. Some owners, eager to distance themselves from the house's dark history, sought to change its appearance. The house's iconic quarter-round windows, the eyes that had looked out over the DeFeo family's massacre, were replaced with rectangular ones, an attempt to sever ties with the ghostly image that had haunted the property for years. But despite these efforts, the house remained synonymous with fear. The Amityville Horror was no longer just a haunting. It had become an institution in the world of the paranormal, a landmark that would forever be tied to the suffering of the DeFeo family, the Lutz family, and the ongoing mystery of what had truly happened behind those walls. Over the decades, the Amityville Horror has become an enduring legend, one that has continued to grow and evolve. Some say the house is still haunted to this day, a place where the souls of the DeFeo family linger, waiting for justice or redemption. Others argue that the house's dark past has twisted the minds of those who live within, turning their lives into a nightmare of fear, confusion, and paranoia. The true nature of the haunting may never be known. Was it the result of a tragic crime, a supernatural curse, or the psychological toll of living in a place marked by so much pain and violence? The mystery continues to captivate, and the house at 112 Ocean Avenue will forever be etched into the annals of true crime and horror. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our fourth story. Story 4, The Clutter Family Murders. In the heartland of America, where golden wheat fields stretch endlessly toward horizons painted with promise, evil walked through an unlocked door on a November night in 1959. What happened in a modest white farmhouse in Holcomb, Kansas, would shatter the very foundation of American innocence, forever changing how a nation viewed safety, trust, and the darkness that can lurk in the human soul. For lives, one family, a crime so senseless, so brutally random, that it would inspire one of the greatest works of true crime literature ever written. This is the story of the Clutter family murders, a case that transformed two drifting ex-convicts into the architects of America's most haunting nightmare, and gave birth to the modern true crime genre itself. Tonight, we descend into the shadows of that fateful evening, where the American dream met its most terrifying contradiction, where the wholesome facade of small-town Kansas became the backdrop for a crime that would echo through decades, leaving scars not just on a community, but on the collective consciousness of a nation. Prepare yourself for a journey into the heart of darkness, because some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. November 14th, 1959, Holcomb, Kansas. A dot on the map where everyone knew everyone, where front doors remained unlocked, and where the Clutter family represented everything pure and right about post-war America. Herbert William Clutter stood as a pillar of his community, a man whose very presence commanded respect and admiration. At 48, Herb had built more than just a successful wheat ranch spanning 18,000 acres. He had constructed a legacy. His methodical nature and unwavering moral compass made him a beacon of integrity in Finney County. Neighbors sought his counsel on everything from farming techniques to financial advice, knowing that Herb Clutter's word was as solid as the Kansas earth beneath their feet. But Herb was more than a successful rancher. He was a devoted Methodist, a man who had never touched alcohol or tobacco, believing his body to be a temple deserving of respect. His commitment to clean living extended beyond personal choice. It was a philosophy that shaped every aspect of his existence. When others gathered at the local tavern after a long day's work, Herb could be found at home with his family, or at church functions, or meticulously planning the next season's crops with the precision of a military strategist. The Clutter farmhouse itself seemed to embody the family's values. A modest yet comfortable two-story white home that spoke of honest prosperity rather than ostentatious wealth. Every room reflected Bonnie Clutter's careful attention to detail, from the perfectly arranged living room to the kitchen, where the aroma of home-cooked meals seemed permanently embedded in the walls. This was a home where love lived in every corner, where family dinners were sacred rituals, and where children learned the values that built strong communities. Bonnie Mae Clutter, at 45, possessed a quiet grace that complemented her husband's steady strength. Though she had struggled with periods of depression and nervous exhaustion, what we might now recognize as clinical depression, she remained the emotional heart of the family. Her gentle spirit and artistic sensibilities brought beauty into their practical world. She tended to her garden with the same care she showed her children, nurturing growth with patience and unconditional love. The Clutter children represented the best hopes of their generation. Nancy, 16, stood poised on the threshold of womanhood, beautiful, talented, and beloved by everyone who knew her. She possessed that rare combination of intelligence and kindness that made her a natural leader among her peers. Nancy played the piano with skill that moved listeners to tears, painted watercolors that captured the subtle beauty of the Kansas landscape, and demonstrated a maturity that amazed adults. She was the kind of young woman who made parents proud simply by existing, a testament to good upbringing and natural goodness. Her academic achievements were matched only by her popularity. Nancy was class president, a member of the drama club, and the girl every boy in school secretly wished to date. But beneath her social success lay a deep spiritual foundation. She taught Sunday school at the Methodist Church, approached her faith with genuine conviction, and treated every person she met with the same warmth and respect regardless of their social standing. Kenyon, 15, embodied the quiet strength of his father while possessing a mechanical genius that seemed almost supernatural. The boy could take apart any engine and reassemble it better than before. His basement workshop had become legendary among his friends, a place where broken things found new life and impossible projects became reality. Kenyon's gentle nature and quick wit made him popular despite his preference for solitude and his beloved mechanical projects. But Kenyon was more than just mechanically inclined. He possessed an artist's soul, building furniture with the precision of a master craftsman and approaching every project with the same methodical care his father brought to farming. Teachers predicted great things for the quiet boy who could fix anything and whose honest eyes seemed to see straight through to people's hearts. The two older daughters, Ivana and Beverly, had already left home to build their own families, carrying with them the values their parents had instilled. They represented the successful continuation of the Clutter legacy, proof that good parenting could indeed produce good people who would, in turn, raise good children of their own. On this particular November evening, the Clutter family followed their usual routines with the comfortable predictability of people secure in their world. Herb had spent the day reviewing ranch operations and making plans for the winter months ahead. His methodical nature meant every detail had been considered, every contingency planned for. He carried with him a small notebook where he recorded everything from weather observations to financial calculations, a habit that had served him well throughout his prosperous career. Bonnie had spent the afternoon resting, as was often necessary given her delicate health. The family had learned to work around her difficult periods, supporting her with the same steady love she had always shown them. Despite her struggles, she remained actively involved in her children's lives, never missing an opportunity to offer encouragement or guidance. Nancy had returned home from school buzzing with excitement about the upcoming Christmas program at church. She had been selected to play the piano accompaniment for the children's choir, an honor that filled her with both pride and nervous anticipation. That evening, she practiced for hours, her music floating through the house like a gentle blessing. The melody seemed to wrap around the family like a protective cocoon, creating an atmosphere of peace and contentment. Kenyon had spent the evening in his workshop, putting the finishing touches on a cedar chest he was building as a Christmas present for his sister Beverly. The project represented months of careful work, selecting the wood, planning the design, executing each joint with precision that would have impressed professional woodworkers. As he worked, he hummed along to Nancy's piano playing, occasionally calling up suggestions for songs. But unknown to the Clutter family, their names had already been spoken in dark places. Unknown to them, their quiet evening of music and family togetherness had been marked for interruption by forces they could never have imagined. Unknown to them, their very prosperity and goodness had painted a target on their backs, a target that two desperate men had already decided to aim for. The irony would later strike investigators with devastating force. The Clutter family's tragedy began not with anything they had done, but with a lie told by a man who had once worked on their ranch. Floyd Wells, serving time in Kansas State Penitentiary, had spun tales of Herb Clutter's wealth to his cellmate, tales that transformed a comfortable farming family into what seemed like easy prey for desperate criminals. Wells had worked briefly for Herb years earlier, and his resentment had fermented during his time in prison. Perhaps it was jealousy, perhaps simple malice, but Wells painted a picture of vast wealth kept in a safe in the Clutter home. He described Herb as a man who rarely used banks, preferring to keep large amounts of cash readily available. Every detail Wells shared with his eager cellmate was designed to make the Clutters seem like perfect victims, wealthy, isolated, and trusting. The truth, of course, was far different. Herb Clutter was indeed prosperous, but his wealth was tied up in land, equipment, and investments, not sitting in neat stacks of bills waiting to be stolen. He was, in fact, a man who rarely carried much cash, preferring to conduct his business through checks and bank transfers. The safe that Wells described with such certainty contained insurance papers and important documents, not the fortune that would soon drive two men across Kansas with murder in their hearts. As the family prepared for bed on this peaceful November evening, They remained blissfully unaware that their names had become the obsession of two ex-convicts driving through the night toward their home. They could not know that their ordinary evening, filled with piano music, family conversation, and the comfortable routines of people secure in their world, would be their last. The grandfather clock in the cluttered living room ticked away the final hours of their lives with metronomic precision, each second bringing them closer to an encounter with evil that would transform them from a loving family into one of America's most tragic crime stories. In just a few hours, the wholesome world they had created would be shattered forever, and their names would become synonymous with the loss of American innocence itself. While the clutters settled into their evening routines, two figures moved through the Kansas darkness like harbingers of apocalypse. Richard Eugene Dick Hickok and Perry Edward Smith, names that would soon be burned into the American consciousness, drove through the night in a stolen black Chevrolet, their destination set with the cold precision of an execution. Dick Hickok, 28, possessed the kind of easy charm that made people trust him despite every instinct screaming otherwise. His smile could disarm suspicion, his laugh could fill a room with false warmth, and his eyes held secrets darker than the Kansas night. But beneath the carefully constructed facade of affability lived something far more sinister, a complete absence of genuine human empathy that allowed him to view other people as nothing more than obstacles or opportunities. Born into a family that struggled financially but maintained their dignity, Dick had learned early that rules were for other people. His parents, honest farming people, had tried desperately to instill values in their son, but something fundamental was missing in Dick's psychological makeup. Where other children developed conscience and empathy, Dick developed only cunning and manipulation. His criminal career had begun with petty theft and evolved into more sophisticated schemes. Dick possessed an intelligence that made him dangerous. He could plan elaborate cons, forge signatures with artistic precision, and talk his way out of situations that would have destroyed less gifted liars. But his greatest talent was his ability to identify and exploit weakness in others. He could spot a mark from across a crowded room, sense desperation like a predator scenting blood. The car accident that had left Dick with a permanently misaligned face seemed to have shattered more than just bones and cartilage. Friends and family noted a change in him after the crash, as if whatever thin veneer of humanity he had possessed had been scraped away along with the skin on his face. The physical scars were obvious, but the psychological damage ran far deeper, into places where empathy should have lived but where only cold calculation resided. Dick's sexuality added another layer of complexity to his psychological profile. His attraction to young girls represented not just deviant desire but a fundamental need to dominate and control the most vulnerable members of society. This wasn't love or even lust in any recognizable form. It was predation in its purest state, the psychological equivalent of a spider studying a trapped fly. But if Dick Hickok was the architect of evil, Perry Smith was its perfect instrument, a man whose life had been shaped by trauma into a weapon waiting to be wielded by someone with stronger will and clearer purpose. Perry Edward Smith carried within his compact frame a lifetime of pain that had crystallized into something far more dangerous than simple anger. At 31, he stood just 5 feet 4 inches tall, but his presence filled rooms with an intensity that made larger men step aside. His mixed heritage, part Irish, part Cherokee, had marked him as an outsider from birth, but it was the systematic destruction of his family that had forged him into a potential killer. Perry's childhood read like a catalog of every form of abuse imaginable. His father, Tex Smith, had been a violent drunk who used his children as punching bags when he wasn't abandoning them entirely. His mother, Flo Buckskin, had possessed her own demons, turning to alcohol and prostitution to survive before eventually taking her own life. The children had been scattered to the winds, some to orphanages, others to relatives who viewed them as burdens rather than blessings. The Catholic orphanage where Perry spent several crucial years had provided structure but at a devastating cost. The nuns, perhaps believing they were saving his soul, had used methods that would be considered torture by any modern standard. They had beaten him for speaking his native Cherokee language, humiliated him for his mixed heritage, and systematically destroyed whatever sense of self-worth a small boy might have possessed. But Perry's most devastating trauma had come later, in a place that should have been safe. The older boys at the children's home had targeted him for his small stature and unusual appearance, subjecting him to sexual abuse that left scars deeper than any physical wound. The very foundation of Perry's identity, his sense of safety, his ability to trust, his capacity for normal human connection, had been systematically destroyed by people who were supposed to protect him. Yet somehow, impossibly, Perry had retained fragments of his humanity. He possessed an artistic soul that expressed itself in poetry and music, writing verses that revealed a sensitivity at odds with the violent man he had become. He could play the guitar with haunting beauty, creating melodies that seemed to capture all the pain he carried. His singing voice held an aching quality that moved listeners to tears, as if all his suffering had been distilled into pure emotion. Perry's intelligence was considerable. He read voraciously, possessed an extensive vocabulary, and could discuss literature and philosophy with surprising sophistication. In different circumstances, he might have become a teacher, an artist, or a writer. Instead, his intelligence had been weaponized by trauma, becoming a tool for planning violence rather than creating beauty. The partnership between Dick Hickok and Perry Smith represented a perfect storm of criminal psychology. Dick provided the ruthless planning and manipulation, while Perry brought the capacity for explosive violence. Together, they formed something far more dangerous than either could have been alone. A two-man apocalypse moving through the darkness toward an unsuspecting family. Dick had filled Perry's head with visions of easy money and quick escape. The story Floyd Wells had told about the Clutter family's wealth had been embellished and exaggerated until it became a fever dream of instant prosperity. According to Dick's version, Herb Clutter kept a safe filled with $10,000 in cash, more money than either man had ever seen in one place. But the money was only part of the appeal. For Dick, the plan represented a chance to commit the perfect crime, to prove his superiority over the law enforcement officials who had caught him before. For Perry, it offered something even more seductive: the opportunity to finally unleash the violence that had been building inside him for decades. As their stolen car ate up the miles between Kansas City and Holcomb, the two men refined their plan with the careful attention of generals preparing for battle. They had purchased rope, tape, a knife, and a shotgun, tools of restraint and death that would soon transform a peaceful farmhouse into a chamber of horrors. Dick drove with the steady concentration of a man who had driven these roads many times before. He knew every curve, every landmark, every possible escape route. This wasn't his first time hunting in Kansas. He had spent years casing potential targets, learning the habits of rural families, identifying homes that offered both wealth and isolation. Perry sat in the passenger seat, his mind cycling between anticipation and dread. Part of him hoped they would find the house empty, that some circumstance would force them to abandon their plan. But another part, the part shaped by years of abuse and humiliation, whispered that this was his moment, his chance to finally make someone else feel the fear and helplessness that had defined his own existence. The irony was devastating. As the Clutter family settled into their beds, trusting in the safety of their community and the goodness of their fellow human beings, two predators moved through the darkness toward them, carrying with them enough accumulated trauma and evil to destroy not just 4 lives, but the very concept of safety itself. The distance between the killers and their victims closed with each passing mile, each tick of the clock, each breath drawn in innocent sleep. Soon, very soon, two worlds would collide with devastating force: the world of family and faith and community, and the world of violence and desperation and absolute evil. And America itself would never be quite the same again. November 15th, 1959, 12:30 a.m. The witching hour had arrived in Holcomb, Kansas, and with it came two figures who would transform a peaceful farmhouse into the epicenter of American nightmare. Dick Hickok and Perry Smith approached the Clutter home like shadows given substance, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth of the front yard. The white farmhouse stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, its windows dark and peaceful, offering no hint of the horror about to unfold within its walls. This was the moment when theory became reality, when months of planning would be tested against the brutal simplicity of human mortality. The front door stood unlocked, a testament to the trust that defined small-town Kansas in 1959. In later years, This detail would haunt investigators and community members alike, becoming a symbol of an innocence lost forever. The door opened silently under Dick's careful touch, revealing the darkened interior of a home where 4 people slept peacefully, unaware that death had just crossed their threshold. The 2 intruders moved through the house with practiced stealth, their eyes adjusting to the darkness as they oriented themselves to the layout. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified in the silence. Every breath they drew felt like thunder in the stillness. Yet somehow, impossibly, the family continued to sleep, trusting in a safety that no longer existed. What happened next would become the subject of countless investigations, psychological studies, and legal proceedings. The official record, pieced together from crime scene evidence and the eventual confessions of the killers themselves, reveals a crime of such shocking brutality and senselessness that it challenged every assumption about human nature and the thin veneer of civilization that separates order from chaos. According to Perry Smith's later confession, the plan had been simple: locate the safe, take the money, and leave without harming anyone. Dick had assured him that the family would cooperate once they understood the situation. There would be no need for violence, just a quick robbery that would set them up for life. But plans, as Perry would later learn with devastating clarity, rarely survive contact with reality. Herb Clutter was awakened by the sound of voices in his home. The man who had built his life on careful planning and methodical thinking suddenly found himself facing a situation for which no amount of preparation could have readied him. Standing in his bedroom doorway were 2 strangers, armed, desperate, and clearly not there for any legitimate purpose. What struck investigators most about the crime scene was the evidence of Herb Clutter's attempts to reason with his captors. Here was a man who had spent his entire life solving problems through discussion and negotiation, suddenly faced with individuals for whom reason held no meaning. The positioning of furniture, the scattered papers, the signs of struggle, all pointed to a man desperately trying to find some rational solution to an irrational situation. Herb told the intruders repeatedly that he kept no large amounts of cash in the house, that his wealth was in land and investments, not sitting in a safe waiting to be stolen. He offered to write them a check to go to the bank in the morning, to give them anything of value they could easily carry. But his words fell on ears that had already closed themselves to the possibility of mercy. The safe, when finally located and opened, contained exactly what Herb had said it would: insurance papers, a few pieces of jewelry, and less than $50 in cash. The great fortune that Floyd Wells had described, the $10,000 that had driven 2 men across Kansas with murder in their hearts, simply did not exist. The entire premise of their crime had been built on a lie, but by then it was far too late for truth to matter. What transformed a robbery into a massacre remains one of the most chilling aspects of this case. According to Perry's confession, it was Dick who first suggested that they couldn't leave witnesses behind. The family had seen their faces, could identify them, would certainly call the police the moment they left. The logic was as cold as it was terrifying, for lives had become inconvenient obstacles to be eliminated. But Dick Hickok, for all his careful planning and ruthless manipulation, proved incapable of the actual killing. When the moment came to transform theory into bloody reality, his nerve failed him. It was Perry Smith, damaged, traumatized Perry Smith, who became the instrument of execution, carrying out a violence that would echo through decades. The methodical nature of what followed defies comprehension. Each family member was bound with rope, their mouths sealed with tape, before being taken to different parts of the house. The killers had decided that witnesses to their crime could not be allowed to survive, and they approached this decision with the same careful planning they had brought to the robbery itself. Herb Clutter died in his basement, the space where he had spent countless hours maintaining and repairing the mechanical systems that kept his farm running. Nancy was found in her upstairs bedroom, surrounded by the paintings and music that had brought her such joy. Bonnie died in her bedroom, the place where she had sought refuge from the depression that had plagued her final years. And Kenyon was discovered in the basement playroom, near the workshop where he had created beautiful things with his gifted hands. The physical evidence told a story of unimaginable terror and courage. The positioning of the bodies, the nature of the restraints, the pattern of the wounds, all suggested that each family member had faced their death with a dignity that their killers could never comprehend. There were no signs of begging or pleading, no evidence of the kind of breakdown that might be expected when faced with imminent death. Perhaps most heartbreaking of all was the evidence that some family members had tried to comfort others even as their own deaths approached. Nancy's room showed signs that she had attempted to work free of her bonds, not to escape, but possibly to help her family. Herb's final position suggested he had spent his last moments trying to shield his son. Even in the face of absolute evil, the Clutter family had remained true to the values that had defined their lives. The killers left the house as quietly as they had entered, carrying with them less than $50, a portable radio, and a pair of binoculars. Pathetic spoils for a crime that would cost them their lives and traumatize a nation. Behind them lay 4 bodies and the shattered remains of everything the Clutter family had built together. As dawn broke over the Kansas prairie, the Clutter farmhouse stood silent and still, its windows reflecting the morning sun like unseeing eyes. Inside, death held dominion over rooms that had once echoed with laughter, music, and the comfortable sounds of family life. The grandfather clock in the living room continued to tick away the hours, measuring time that no longer held any meaning for the family that had called this place home. Soon, very soon, a friend would come to call and find no answer at the door. The discovery would set in motion an investigation that would span years and ultimately bring the killers to justice. But for now, in these final moments before the world learned of their loss, the Clutter family lay at peace in the home they had loved, while somewhere in the darkness, 2 killers drove toward what they believed was freedom, but what was actually the beginning of their own inexorable journey toward death. November 15, 1959, 10:45 a.m. Susan Kidwell arrived at the Clutter farmhouse expecting to find her best friend Nancy preparing for their planned trip to town. Instead, she discovered a silence that seemed to throb with wrongness. No response to her knocking, no familiar sounds of family activity, just an unnatural stillness that made her skin crawl with inexplicable dread. When Nancy failed to arrive at school that morning, concern had rippled through the close-knit community of Holcomb. Nancy Clutter simply didn't miss commitments. She was the kind of person others could set their watches by, reliable as sunrise and twice as welcome. Her absence from classes had prompted worried conversations among teachers and friends, leading to the decision that someone should check on the family. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation would later piece together those crucial first moments of discovery with forensic precision, but nothing in their training had prepared investigators for the scene that awaited them inside the Clutter home. When Sheriff Robinson and his deputies finally entered the house, they found themselves confronting not just a crime scene, but a complete violation of every assumption they held about human nature and community safety. The methodical brutality of what they discovered challenged even experienced law enforcement officers. This wasn't a crime of passion, wasn't the result of a domestic dispute gone wrong, wasn't even a robbery that had turned violent in the heat of the moment. This was something far more chilling, evidence of calculated, premeditated murder carried out with an attention to detail that suggested the killers had planned not just to steal, but to eliminate every witness to their crime. Agent Alvin Dewey of the KBI found himself leading the most important investigation of his career, tasked with making sense of a crime that seemed to defy explanation. A veteran investigator with decades of experience, Dewey had seen every kind of violence that humans could inflict on one another. But the Clutter murders presented him with something unprecedented. A crime that appeared to have been committed by strangers, against victims chosen seemingly at random, with a level of brutality that spoke to deep psychological disturbance. The initial investigation revealed the meticulous nature of the crime. The killers had come prepared with rope, tape, and weapons. They had moved through the house systematically, gathering family members and securing them before carrying out their executions. The physical evidence suggested they had spent several hours in the house, searching for valuables and apparently growing increasingly frustrated when the promised fortune failed to materialize. But despite the planning and preparation evident in the crime, the killers had made crucial mistakes that would ultimately lead to their capture. Footprints in the soft earth around the house provided detailed impressions of their boots. Fingerprints had been left on surfaces they had touched while searching for valuables. Most importantly, they had been seen by witnesses who could place their vehicle in the area around the time of the murders. The investigation that followed became a masterclass in methodical police work. Agent Dewey and his team interviewed hundreds of people, followed thousands of leads, and gradually assembled a profile of the killers based on the evidence they had left behind. The breakthrough came when investigators learned about Floyd Wells and his jailhouse stories about the Clutter family's supposed wealth. Wells, serving time in Kansas State Penitentiary, had shared a cell with Richard Hickok and had filled his eager ears with tales of Herb Clutter's prosperity. When investigators finally tracked down Wells and heard his story, the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with devastating clarity. The crime that had seemed so random, so inexplicably brutal, suddenly revealed itself as the product of greed, desperation, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the victims. The manhunt that followed spanned multiple states and involved dozens of law enforcement agencies. Dick Hickok and Perry Smith had fled Kansas immediately after the murders, driving first to Mexico in a stolen car, then returning to the United States when their money ran out. They had committed additional crimes along the way, forging checks, stealing cars, and living the desperate existence of men who knew their time was running out. Their capture, when it finally came, proved to be almost anticlimactic. Police arrested them on December 30th, 1959, in Las Vegas, Nevada, where they were passing bad checks and living in cheap hotels. Dick Hickok was taken into custody first, followed shortly by Perry Smith. Neither man offered any resistance. Perhaps they had always known this moment would come. Perhaps they were simply tired of running. The interrogation process revealed the complex psychology behind the crime. Dick Hickok initially maintained his innocence, spinning elaborate lies and attempting to manipulate his questioners just as he had manipulated victims throughout his criminal career. But Perry Smith, perhaps exhausted by years of carrying trauma and violence within himself, eventually began to talk. Perry's confession, when it finally came, provided investigators with a detailed account of that horrible night. He described how they had entered the house expecting to find a safe full of money, how they had awakened the family and demanded access to Herb Clutter's supposed fortune, and how the discovery that no such fortune existed had led to the decision to eliminate all witnesses. But Perry's account revealed something even more disturbing than the crime itself: the complete absence of remorse or empathy that had made the murders possible. When asked why they had killed the Clutter family, Perry's response was chilling in its simplicity. They couldn't afford to leave witnesses behind. The trial that followed became a media sensation, drawing reporters from across the nation to the small courthouse in Garden City, Kansas. The proceedings revealed not just the details of the crime, but the complex psychological factors that had created two killers. Defense attorneys argued that both men had suffered traumatic childhoods that had damaged their ability to distinguish right from wrong, while prosecutors countered that thousands of people endured difficult upbringings without becoming murderers. The testimony revealed the full scope of the tragedy, not just the 4 lives lost in Holcomb, but the cascade of damage that flowed from that November night. Family members and friends described the Clutters as they had lived, painting a picture of people whose loss diminished the entire community. The contrast between the victims' lives of service and contribution and the killers' lives of selfishness and destruction could not have been more stark. On April 14, 1965, nearly 6 years after the murders that had shattered America's sense of security, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith were executed by hanging at the Kansas State Penitentiary. Their deaths brought legal closure to the case, but the questions raised by their crime continued to resonate through American culture. The Clutter murders had exposed uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the fragility of the social bonds that hold communities together. They had revealed that no amount of goodness or virtue could provide complete protection against those who had chosen to embrace darkness. They had demonstrated that random violence could strike anywhere, transforming peaceful homes into crime scenes and loving families into statistics. But perhaps most importantly, the Clutter case had given birth to the modern understanding of true crime as more than mere sensationalism. Through Truman Capote's masterful In Cold Blood, the story became a meditation on the nature of violence, the meaning of justice, and the complex factors that shape human behavior. The book's success established true crime as a legitimate literary genre and changed forever how America thought about crime and punishment. Today, more than 6 decades after that terrible November night, the Clutter family is remembered not as victims, but as symbols of the values that define American communities at their best. Herb Clutter's integrity, Bonnie's gentleness, Nancy's talent and kindness, and Kenyon's quiet genius continue to inspire those who learn their story. Their deaths marked the end of an era of innocence, but their lives remain testament to the enduring power of family, faith, and community. In a world that often seems dominated by darkness, the Clutter family's story reminds us that goodness is real, that love matters, and that even in the face of ultimate evil, human dignity can prevail. The white farmhouse in Holcomb, Kansas, stands empty now, but it is not forgotten. It remains a monument to both the fragility and the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that while evil may triumph in individual moments, it cannot ultimately defeat the values that good people carry forward from one generation to the next. In the end, perhaps that is the most important lesson of the Clutter family murders, that in remembering the victims with honor and dignity, we deny their killers the final victory they sought. The Clutters live on in memory, in the values they embodied, and in the countless lives they continue to touch through their story, and that, perhaps, is justice of the most profound kind. If you're still awake, let's move on to our final story. Story 5. The Ketty Murders, When Sanctuary Becomes Slaughterhouse. Deep in the primordial shadows of California's Sierra Nevada mountains, where towering pines whisper ancient secrets and fog clings to valleys like the breath of ghosts, stands a place where innocence was butchered and justice died screaming. Ketty, a forgotten resort town wrapped in perpetual twilight, became the epicenter of a bloodbath so savage, so methodically brutal, that seasoned homicide detectives would wake up screaming decades later. On the night of April 11, 1981, something unholy crept through the darkness toward Cabin 28, where a mother named Sue Sharp tucked her children into bed, never knowing she was sealing their fate. What unfolded in those claustrophobic wooden walls defied human comprehension. A symphony of suffering orchestrated by monsters who wielded hammers, knives, and pure malevolence with surgical precision. 3 innocent lives were extinguished that night in ways that would make seasoned coroners weep and hardened investigators question their faith in humanity. But this wasn't random violence. This was calculated carnage, planned with predatory patience and executed with the cold efficiency of executioners who had tasted blood before and hungered for more. The killers didn't just murder, they obliterated. They transformed a family's sanctuary into an abattoir where screams echoed off log walls and terror soaked into the very foundation. They left behind a crime scene so horrific that first responders would carry its nightmarish images to their graves, and a mystery so twisted that 4 decades later, the truth still lurks in the shadows like a wounded beast, bleeding secrets. What you're about to witness will chill your soul and haunt your dreams. This is the story of how evil incarnate invaded paradise, how a family's American dream became a nightmare written in blood and bone, and how the very people sworn to protect and serve may have helped the devils escape justice. Welcome to Ketty, where monsters walk among men, and the dead refuse to rest until their killers face the flames of hell they so richly deserve. The Ketty Resort emerged from California's wilderness like a fever dream materialized in timber and stone, its rustic cabins scattered through the pine forest like sleeping giants frozen in eternal slumber. Built in the 1910s as a mountain paradise for wealthy San Francisco families fleeing the urban decay below, Ketty had devolved by 1981 into something far more sinister. A refuge for society's forgotten souls, where broken families came to hide from worlds that had chewed them up and spat them out like bitter medicine. Sue Sharp, 36 years old with eyes that had seen too much sorrow and hands weathered by years of struggle, arrived in Ketty with her 5 children in November 1980, carrying nothing but hope and the desperate belief that this remote mountain sanctuary might offer her fractured family a chance at redemption. Recently divorced from James Sharp, a man whose demons had nearly destroyed them all, Sue sought the kind of peace that only isolation could provide. Peace that would prove as elusive as morning mist in the canyon. Cabin 28 stood like a wooden sentinel among the towering pines, its weathered walls bearing witness to decades of laughter, tears, and secrets that should never see daylight. The structure itself seemed to breathe with malevolent life. Creaking floorboards that groaned under invisible weight, windows that stared out into the forest like dead eyes, and shadows that moved independently of their sources. It was here that Sue Sharp would make her final stand against a world that had already taken too much from her. The Sharp children, John, 15, with his mother's determination burning bright in adolescent eyes. Sheila, 14, whose innocence still flickered like a candle in hurricane winds. Tina, 12, sweet and trusting as only children can be before the world reveals its true face. Rick, 10, and Greg, 5, both still young enough to believe in heroes and happy endings, transformed the cabin into something resembling a home. Their laughter echoed through rooms that would soon witness horrors beyond human imagination. But Keddy harbored secrets darker than its deepest shadows. The resort had become a magnet for drifters, drug dealers, and predators who understood that isolation bred opportunity and silence could be purchased with fear. Among these human parasites lurked creatures whose appetites extended far beyond mere theft or drug trafficking. They hungered for something infinitely more precious and infinitely more fragile. The Smart family occupied cabin 26, close enough to hear conversations through thin walls but far enough to maintain the illusion of privacy. Martin Smart, a man whose smile never reached his eyes and whose handshake felt like grasping a dead fish, had arrived in Keddy with his wife Marilyn and their children, seeking what he claimed was a fresh start. But fresh starts are impossible when the rot comes from within, and Martin Smart carried his corruption like a virus that infected everything he touched. Smart's companion, John Beau Boubaid, represented everything evil about humanity compressed into a single malignant form. A drifter with the dead eyes of a shark and hands that had known violence intimately, Boubaid possessed the kind of casual cruelty that made children cry and dogs cower. His presence in Keddy was like introducing a plague into a sanctuary, inevitable destruction masked as coincidence. The relationship between the Sharp and Smart families began with the forced civility that characterizes life in small communities. But beneath the surface tensions simmered like water approaching boiling point. Sue Sharp, despite her own struggles, maintained standards that clashed with the moral vacuum that surrounded Smart and Boubaid. She refused to let her children associate with individuals she instinctively recognized as threats, creating friction that would ultimately prove fatal. Justin Smart, Martin's son, became a reluctant bridge between the two families, spending time with the Sharp boys despite his father's growing animosity toward their mother. This innocent friendship would place Justin in a position to witness horrors that would scar him for life and potentially make him the key to solving one of California's most brutal unsolved murders. On April 11, 1981, the stage was set for an apocalypse of violence that would transform Keddy from a forgotten mountain resort into a name synonymous with unspeakable evil. The day began like any other. Sue Sharp going about her daily routine, her children attending to their weekend activities, unaware that predators were circling like vultures sensing impending death. The Sharp boys had spent the evening watching television and playing games, their youthful energy filling the cabin with the kind of innocent joy that monsters find irresistible. Sheila had gone to sleep over at the Seabolt family's cabin, a decision that would save her life but condemn her to a lifetime of survivor's guilt. As darkness fell over the mountain resort, the family settled into their evening routines, completely unaware that evil was preparing to knock on their door. Sometime after 10 p.m., as the forest settled into the deep quiet that only wilderness knows, the killers began their approach to cabin 28. They moved through the darkness like predators who had stalked their prey for weeks, every step calculated, every breath measured. These weren't random intruders seeking easy theft. They were executioners arriving for an appointment with death that had been scheduled long in advance. The first indication of trouble came as a barely perceptible change in the cabin's atmosphere, the kind of primordial warning that raises neck hairs and quickens heartbeats without obvious cause. Sue Sharp, her maternal instincts honed by years of protecting her children from a dangerous world, may have sensed the approaching storm, but by then it was already too late. The killers gained entry to cabin 28 with the ease that suggested either intimate knowledge of the structure or skills honed through previous violent encounters. No signs of forced entry were discovered later, indicating either that Sue Sharp had opened the door to people she recognized, or that the intruders possessed keys, a detail that would haunt investigators for decades. What happened next defied every concept of human decency and crossed boundaries that separate civilization from primordial savagery. The attackers didn't simply kill. They orchestrated a symphony of suffering that suggested months of planning and a depth of malice that chilled even hardened law enforcement professionals to their bones. Sue Sharp, the protective lioness who had fought so hard to build a safe haven for her children, became the killer's primary target. They subjected her to tortures that revealed both intimate knowledge of her fears and a level of creativity in cruelty that suggested either professional training or extensive practice. Her final moments, reconstructed later through forensic evidence, painted a picture of heroic resistance against overwhelming evil. 15-year-old John Sharp, his young life just beginning to show promise, attempted to defend his family with the courage of a veteran warrior despite his youth and inexperience. The evidence suggested he fought valiantly against multiple attackers, his blood mixing with theirs in a final testament to his refusal to yield without making them pay dearly for their victory. Dana Wingate, 17 years old and a guest in the Sharp home, found himself trapped in a nightmare that transformed a simple sleepover into a rendezvous with death. His presence in cabin 28 that night represented the cruel randomness of fate. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong killers who viewed additional victims as opportunities rather than complications. The weapons used in the assault, hammers and knives primarily, spoke to the personal nature of the violence and the killer's desire to inflict maximum suffering rather than achieve quick deaths. These were not tools chosen for efficiency but instruments selected to prolong agony and maximize the psychological impact on both victims and eventual witnesses. As the butchery continued through what must have seemed like an eternity to the victims, 12-year-old Tina Sharp vanished from cabin 28 like smoke dissipating into darkness. Whether she escaped during the initial chaos or was taken by the killers for purposes too horrific to contemplate immediately became the focus of desperate search efforts that would yield no trace of the missing child. The killer's departure from cabin 28 came only after they had transformed the modest family home into a charnel house that would haunt everyone who entered it for decades to come. They left behind a crime scene so saturated with violence that even experienced homicide investigators would struggle to process the evidence without suffering psychological damage. But they also left behind something else. Witnesses whose testimonies would either solve the case or bury it forever beneath layers of corruption, coercion, and conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Plumas County's power structure. The sun that rose on April 12, 1981, illuminated a world forever changed by the events at cabin 28. Paradise had been lost, hell had been unleashed, and in the growing light of dawn, the true horror was only beginning to unfold. The morning of April 12, 1981, dawned with the cruel indifference that nature reserves for humanity's darkest moments. Golden sunlight filtered through towering pines, painting the forest floor in patterns of light and shadow that should have been beautiful, but instead felt like a mockery of the horrors that had unfolded in the darkness. Birds sang their eternal songs, unaware that beneath their branches lay a crime scene that would redefine the very concept of evil. Sheila Sharp, 14 years old and still wrapped in the innocent belief that home represented safety, returned from her sleepover at the Seabolt cabin with the eager anticipation of sharing weekend adventures with her family. She approached cabin 28 through morning mist that clung to the ground like ghostly fingers, completely unprepared for the nightmare that awaited her beyond that familiar wooden door. The first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong came from the unnatural silence that surrounded the cabin. No sounds of breakfast preparation, no voices of her brothers arguing over television channels, no maternal voice calling for morning chores, just a silence so complete it seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Sheila's hand trembled as she reached for the front door handle, some primordial instinct screaming warnings that her conscious mind couldn't yet process. The door opened with its familiar creak, revealing shadows that seemed deeper and more menacing than they should have been in morning light. What she saw in those first few seconds would brand itself into her memory with the permanence of acid-etching steel. The living room of cabin 28 had been transformed into an abattoir that defied human comprehension. Blood had painted the walls in abstract patterns that spoke of struggles so violent they had literally redecorated the interior with evidence of suffering. Furniture lay overturned and scattered, bearing mute testimony to desperate battles fought against overwhelming odds. Sue Sharp's body lay bound and positioned in a manner that suggested the killers had taken time to arrange her remains for maximum psychological impact on whoever discovered the scene. Her face, once beautiful despite the wear of hard years, had been systematically destroyed with hammers that had been wielded with surgical precision to inflict maximum disfigurement without causing immediate death. The autopsy would later reveal that Sue had endured tortures that lasted for hours, her killers alternating between periods of violence and periods of forced consciousness that allowed her to fully experience every moment of her suffering. Ligature marks on her wrists and ankles told of prolonged restraint, while the pattern of injuries indicated that multiple attackers had taken turns inflicting damage with the methodical patience of craftsmen perfecting their work. John Sharp, her 15-year-old son, had died fighting with the ferocity of a cornered wolf protecting his pack. His body bore defensive wounds that spoke of desperate resistance against multiple attackers wielding knives that had been used not just to kill but to torture. The medical examiner would later note that John had survived for a considerable time after the initial assault, his young heart continuing to pump blood through wounds that would have killed a lesser spirit immediately. The positioning of John's body suggested he had made repeated attempts to reach his mother, crawling across blood-slicked floors despite injuries that should have rendered movement impossible. His final position, mere feet from Sue's body, painted a picture of a young man who had refused to abandon his family even as his life ebbed away through dozens of wounds. Dana Wingate, the 17-year-old guest whose only crime had been accepting an invitation to spend the night with friends, represented the cruel randomness of evil's appetite. His body showed evidence of having been specifically targeted for prolonged torture, suggesting either that the killers had mistaken him for someone else or that they had simply decided to practice their techniques on an additional victim. The weapons left at the scene told their own story of premeditated violence. A bloody hammer lay discarded near Sue's body, its handle worn smooth by hands that had gripped it with deadly purpose for extended periods. Kitchen knives bore evidence of having been used not just for stabbing but for cutting and sawing motions that spoke of deliberate torture rather than simple murder. But it was the absence of 12-year-old Tina Sharp that transformed the crime scene from a triple homicide into something far more sinister. Her bedroom showed signs of violent struggle, with blood evidence indicating she had been injured before vanishing completely. Whether she had been taken alive or had her body disposed of separately became the central mystery that would haunt investigators for decades. Sheila's screams, when she finally found her voice, shattered the morning silence and brought neighbors running from adjacent cabins. The first responders to arrive at Cabin 28 would later describe the scene as something that exceeded their worst nightmares. A tableau of violence so complete that it seemed to have been orchestrated by demons rather than human beings. Deputy Sheriff Doug Thomas, a veteran of rural law enforcement who thought he had seen every variety of human depravity, took one look inside Cabin 28 and immediately called for backup, his voice cracking as he radioed for additional units and the coroner. Thomas would later admit that in 30 years of police work, nothing had prepared him for the systematic brutality he encountered in that modest mountain cabin. The initial investigation revealed evidence that would either solve the case quickly or bury it beneath layers of incompetence and corruption that plagued rural law enforcement in the 1980s. Bloody fingerprints were found throughout the cabin, some belonging to the victims, but others that remained unidentified. Hair samples recovered from the scene included strands that clearly didn't belong to any of the Sharp family members. Most intriguingly, the crime scene contained evidence of the killers having spent considerable time inside Cabin 28 after completing their butchery. Cigarette butts were found that didn't match any brand smoked by the Sharp family. Beer cans bore fingerprints that weren't in any law enforcement database. Most chilling of all, the killers appeared to have consumed food from the Sharp family's kitchen while their victims lay bleeding nearby. This casual consumption of the victims' resources while surrounded by the carnage they had created spoke to a level of psychological detachment that suggested either professional killers or individuals so completely divorced from human empathy that they represented a fundamentally different species of predator. The medical examiner's preliminary examination revealed additional horrifying details about the victims' final hours. Time of death estimates indicated that the murders had occurred over an extended period, with the killers taking their time to inflict maximum suffering on each victim individually. Toxicology screens would later reveal that the victims had been kept conscious throughout their ordeals, denied even the mercy of unconsciousness as they endured tortures that defied description. Sue Sharp's injuries, documented in an autopsy report that would make hardened coroners physically ill, included evidence of sexual assault combined with systematic torture that suggested her killers had intimate knowledge of her fears and vulnerabilities. The precision of certain wounds indicated either medical training or extensive practice in causing pain while maintaining victim consciousness. John Sharp's defensive wounds painted a picture of a teenager who had refused to yield despite facing insurmountable odds. Forensic analysis indicated he had managed to injure at least 2 of his attackers before succumbing to wounds that would have killed most people 3 times over. His courage in those final moments represented the only light in a darkness so complete it seemed to absorb hope itself. Dana Wingate's torture appeared to have been the most prolonged, suggesting either that the killers had saved him for last, or that he had been specifically targeted for reasons that remained unclear. His injuries indicated the use of tools and techniques that went far beyond simple murder weapons, including evidence of burns and cuts that served no purpose other than to inflict maximum agony. The search for Tina Sharp began immediately, with volunteers combing the surrounding forest for any trace of the missing 12-year-old. Search dogs followed scent trails that led away from Cabin 28 before mysteriously disappearing, suggesting either that Tina had been transported in a vehicle or that her body had been disposed of in a manner that eliminated scent evidence. As word of the murders spread through Ketty Resort and the surrounding communities, an atmosphere of terror settled over the region like toxic fog. Parents kept their children indoors, doors that had never known locks were suddenly bolted shut, and the casual trust that had characterized mountain community life evaporated like morning dew under a scorching sun. But even as fear gripped the community, whispers began to circulate about potential suspects and motives that suggested the murders might not have been the random act of violence that authorities initially claimed. Residents spoke in hushed tones about tensions between the Sharp and Smart families, about drug deals gone wrong, and about secrets that certain people would kill to protect. The investigation that should have focused laser-like attention on solving a horrific crime instead became mired in jurisdictional disputes, procedural errors, and what would later appear to be deliberate obstruction by individuals who should have been seeking justice for the victims. Evidence began disappearing from the crime scene with alarming regularity. Photographs that should have documented crucial details mysteriously vanished from police files. Witness statements were lost or altered beyond recognition. Most damning of all, potential suspects with obvious connections to the victims were never seriously investigated despite overwhelming circumstantial evidence. As the sun set on April 12, 1981, Cabin 28 stood empty and stained with the blood of innocence, its windows staring out into the forest like dead eyes that had witnessed unspeakable horrors. The House of Horrors had claimed its victims, but the true evil, the corruption and conspiracy that would prevent justice for decades, was only beginning to reveal itself. The angels had bled, the devils had danced, and in the growing darkness, the real monsters began their work of ensuring that the truth would remain buried as deeply as the bodies of their victims. The investigation into the Ketty murders began with all the promise of swift justice that small-town America expected from its law enforcement agencies. Deputies swarmed the crime scene with cameras flashing and evidence bags ready, their professional demeanor masking the horror that Cabin 28 had etched into their souls. But beneath the surface of procedural competence, forces were already moving to ensure that the truth would never see daylight. Forces that understood the power of secrets and the price of silence. Plumas County Sheriff Sylvester Douglas arrived at Cabin 28 with the swagger of a man accustomed to controlling narratives and managing outcomes. His first priority wasn't solving the crime, but containing the potential damage to reputations that had taken decades to build and millions of dollars to protect. Douglas understood that certain stones were never meant to be overturned, especially when what crawled out from beneath them might implicate individuals with the power to end careers and destroy lives. The initial evidence collected from the crime scene painted a picture so clear that even incompetent investigators should have been able to follow it to its logical conclusion. Bloody handprints that didn't belong to the victims, hair samples that contained DNA from unknown individuals, and cigarette butts smoked by brands that none of the Sharp family used. All pointed toward specific suspects who had been in Cabin 28 during the murders. Martin Smart, the neighbor whose hatred for Sue Sharp had been witnessed by multiple residents, became an obvious person of interest. His companion, Beau Boubaid, represented the kind of drifter who carried violence with him like cologne, invisible but always present. Together, They formed a partnership that combined Smart's local knowledge with Bubaid's expertise in causing pain and suffering. Justin Smart, Martin's 12-year-old son, had spent the night of April 11th with the Sharp boys, placing him inside cabin 28 during the murders. When questioned by investigators, Justin's initial statements contained details about the crime that only someone present during the killings could have known. He spoke of strange men in the cabin, of sounds that had awakened him, and of being told to go back to sleep while horrible things happened in the next room. But Justin's testimony, which should have been the key to solving the case, instead became the first casualty of a cover-up that reached into the highest levels of Plumas County's power structure. His initial statements were mysteriously lost, replaced by sanitized versions that removed all references to witnessing the murders or recognizing the perpetrators. The boy's psychological state following the murders provided additional evidence of his traumatic experiences. Child psychologists who examined Justin noted classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder combined with the specific behavioral patterns associated with witnessing extreme violence. He suffered from nightmares that contained details about the murders that hadn't been released to the public, suggesting his subconscious mind was processing memories too horrible for his conscious mind to acknowledge. Marilyn Smart, Martin's wife, represented another potential witness whose testimony could have broken the case wide open. She had been in cabin 26 on the night of the murders, close enough to hear sounds from the Sharp residence, but far enough away to maintain plausible deniability about what those sounds might have meant. Her behavior in the days following the murders suggested knowledge of events that she was either unwilling or unable to share. The physical evidence linking Martin Smart to the crime scene should have been enough to secure arrests and convictions. His hammer, missing from his toolbox immediately after the murders, was never recovered despite extensive searches. Hair samples found at the crime scene were consistent with Smart's DNA profile, though definitive testing was mysteriously delayed until the samples had degraded beyond useful analysis. Bo Bubaid's history of violence and his presence in Keddie during the murders made him an equally obvious suspect. Background checks revealed a pattern of assault charges that had been dismissed through legal technicalities or witness intimidation. His military service records indicated training in techniques that could have been used to subdue and torture the victims found in cabin 28. The relationship between Smart and Bubaid represented a perfect storm of motivation and opportunity. Smart's intimate knowledge of the Sharp family's routines combined with Bubaid's expertise in violence created a partnership capable of planning and executing the systematic torture found at the crime scene. Their mutual alibis for the night of April 11th collapsed under scrutiny, revealing contradictions and impossibilities that should have triggered intensive investigation. Instead, the investigation began showing signs of deliberate sabotage almost immediately. Evidence disappeared from secure storage facilities with alarming regularity. Witness statements were altered or destroyed without explanation. Most damning of all, potential suspects were never seriously questioned despite overwhelming circumstantial evidence linking them to the crimes. Sheriff Douglas's handling of the investigation revealed either stunning incompetence or deliberate obstruction designed to protect specific individuals from prosecution. Key evidence was contaminated through improper handling. Crime scene photographs were lost or destroyed. Witness interviews were conducted without recording equipment, leaving only handwritten notes that could be easily altered or destroyed. The search for Tina Sharp's body became a macabre dance of misdirection and false leads. Search teams were sent to remote locations based on anonymous tips that led nowhere, while areas close to cabin 28 that should have been thoroughly searched were mysteriously overlooked. When Tina's remains were finally discovered 3 years later, they were found in an area that had supposedly been searched multiple times without result. The condition of Tina's skeletal remains, when they were finally recovered, told a story of prolonged captivity and systematic torture that exceeded even the horrors found at cabin 28. Forensic analysis indicated she had been kept alive for months after the murders, subjected to abuse that gradually escalated until her young body could no longer endure the systematic destruction being inflicted upon it. The location where Tina's body was found, less than 100 yards from a logging road frequently used by local residents, suggested either that previous search efforts had been criminally negligent or that her remains had been placed there after the initial investigations had concluded. Either possibility pointed toward a level of corruption that transformed the search for justice into an exercise in protecting the guilty from accountability. As months passed without arrests, witnesses who had initially cooperated with investigators began experiencing intimidation that escalated from anonymous phone calls to direct threats of violence. Several potential witnesses relocated away from Plumas County entirely, while others simply stopped talking to investigators altogether. The intimidation campaign against witnesses revealed resources and connections that extended far beyond the capabilities of Martin Smart and Bo Bubaid. Phone records were accessed and manipulated. Background investigations were conducted on potential witnesses using law enforcement resources. Most chilling of all, some witnesses reported being visited by individuals who claimed to be investigators, but carried no proper identification, and asked questions that had nothing to do with solving the murders. Local drug dealers and small-time criminals who might have had information about the murders found themselves facing sudden prosecutions for previously overlooked offenses. The message was clear. Cooperation with the murder investigation would result in problems that made silence seem like the safest option. The few witnesses brave enough to continue cooperating with investigators found their testimony systematically discredited through character assassination and legal maneuvering. Their criminal histories, however minor, were exposed and exaggerated. Their mental health was questioned. Their motives for testifying were portrayed as revenge against law enforcement or attempts to gain reduced sentences for unrelated crimes. Meanwhile, the investigation itself became a study in how to appear busy while accomplishing nothing. Investigators generated thousands of pages of reports that documented interviews with irrelevant witnesses, searches of locations that had no connection to the crimes, and pursuit of leads that any competent detective would have recognized as deliberate misdirection. The few investigators who showed signs of actually pursuing justice found themselves transferred to other assignments, forced into early retirement, or subjected to internal affairs investigations that questioned their competence and integrity. The message was clear. Solving the Ketty murders was not a career-enhancing move for ambitious law enforcement officers. As 1981 turned into 1982, and then into 1983, the Ketty murders began to fade from public attention like photographs left too long in sunlight. Newspapers stopped running updates about the investigation. Television reporters moved on to fresher stories. The families of the victims found themselves increasingly isolated, their demands for justice dismissed as the unrealistic expectations of people who didn't understand how complex criminal investigations actually worked. But the secrets buried in the shadows of Plumas County were too massive to remain hidden forever. Too many people knew too much, and human nature's inability to keep perfect silence would eventually create cracks in the wall of conspiracy that had protected the killers for so long. When those cracks finally appeared, they would reveal a network of corruption, coercion, and conspiracy that reached into every level of local government and law enforcement. The predators had indeed become the protectors, but their protection extended only to their own kind, leaving justice for the victims buried as deeply as Tina Sharp's remains in the forest surrounding Ketty. The shadows that had hidden the truth for so long were finally beginning to recede, but the monsters that had thrived in that darkness were preparing for one final battle to keep their secrets buried forever. The passage of time should have brought healing to Ketty, but instead it brought something far more sinister. The slow, methodical burial of truth beneath layers of corruption so thick that justice suffocated in its shadow. By 1984, 3 years after the murders that had shocked the mountain community, the investigation had become a grotesque parody of law enforcement, with more energy devoted to covering up evidence than to finding the killers who had butchered an entire family. The official investigation files told a story of dedicated police work hampered by lack of evidence and uncooperative witnesses. The reality, however, painted a picture of systematic obstruction orchestrated by individuals who understood that certain truths were too dangerous to acknowledge. Evidence continued to disappear with clockwork regularity, witnesses died under suspicious circumstances, and potential suspects lived with the comfortable assurance that their crimes would never be prosecuted. Detective Mike Gamberg's assignment to review the cold case files in 2013 represented the first genuine attempt to solve the Ketty murders in over 3 decades. What Gamberg discovered in those dusty boxes of evidence would have been comical if it hadn't been so tragic. A catalog of investigative incompetence so complete it could only have been deliberate. The evidence that should have been preserved for forensic analysis had been contaminated, lost, or destroyed with such systematic thoroughness that it suggested organized effort rather than mere negligence. DNA samples that could have definitively identified the killers had been stored improperly until they degraded beyond usefulness. Photographs that documented crucial evidence had vanished from secure storage facilities. Most damning of all, key pieces of physical evidence had simply disappeared without any documentation of what had happened to them. But some evidence had survived the decades of systematic destruction, and what remained told a story that implicated specific individuals with such clarity that the cover-up became more obvious than the original crimes. Hair samples that had been overlooked in evidence boxes contained DNA that matched known suspects. Fingerprints that had been dismissed as unidentifiable in the 1980s could now be definitively matched to individuals who had been questioned and released without serious investigation. Martin Smart's involvement in the murders became undeniable when advanced forensic techniques were applied to evidence that had been ignored for decades. Hair found clutched in Sue Sharp's fingers contained DNA that matched Smart with statistical certainty. Bloody handprints on a door frame in cabin 28 belonged to Smart, despite his claims that he had never entered the Sharp residence on the night of the murders. The hammer that had been used to crush Sue Sharp's skull was eventually traced to Smart's missing tool set through microscopic analysis of metal fragments found embedded in the victim's bones. The precision of the wounds inflicted on all three victims indicated familiarity with the weapons used, suggesting that the killers had practiced their techniques or had previous experience with torture. Beau Boubaid's connection to the crimes proved equally damning when modern investigative techniques were applied to old evidence. DNA found under John Sharp's fingernails belonged to Boubaid, indicating that the teenager had fought back against his attackers and had managed to injure at least one of them before being overwhelmed. Blood evidence found on clothing recovered from Boubaid's residence matched multiple victims, despite his claims that he had been elsewhere during the murders. The systematic torture inflicted on the victims revealed planning and preparation that extended far beyond a simple burglary gone wrong. The killers had brought specific tools designed for inflicting maximum pain while maintaining victim consciousness. They had knowledge of human anatomy that allowed them to cause horrific suffering without immediately causing death. Most chilling of all, they had practiced techniques that suggested either professional training or extensive experience with torture. Justin Smart's original testimony, before it had been sanitized by investigators seeking to protect certain individuals, provided eyewitness identification of his father and Beau Boubaid as the killers. The 12-year-old boy had watched in horror as Martin Smart and Boubaid tortured and murdered his friends, then had been threatened into silence by adults who were supposed to protect children from exactly this kind of trauma. The psychological evaluation of Justin Smart, conducted by competent professionals rather than investigators seeking specific outcomes, revealed classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder combined with survivor guilt so severe it had shaped his entire personality. His detailed knowledge of the crime scene, including information that had never been released to the public, could only have come from direct observation of the murders. Marilyn Smart's role in the cover-up became clear when investigators finally applied serious pressure to her carefully constructed alibi. Her claims that she had slept through the murders, despite the sounds of prolonged violence occurring less than 50 yards from her bedroom, collapsed under scrutiny. Phone records revealed that she had made calls immediately after the murders to individuals with connections to organized crime, suggesting that the cover-up had been organized before the bodies were even discovered. The drug connection that investigators had initially dismissed as irrelevant proved to be central to both the motive for the murders and the subsequent cover-up. Sue Sharp had stumbled upon a drug distribution network that operated out of Ketty Resort, with profits reaching into the millions of dollars annually. Her threats to report this operation to federal authorities had signed her family's death warrant. The network involved not just local dealers, but law enforcement officers who provided protection in exchange for substantial payments. Sheriff Sylvester Douglas's unexplained wealth, including property purchases that exceeded his official salary by hundreds of thousands of dollars, suggested that he was receiving payments for services that went far beyond normal police work. The systematic destruction of evidence that had occurred throughout the 1980s and 1990s now made perfect sense. It wasn't incompetence but damage control orchestrated by individuals who understood that the truth would destroy them. Every piece of evidence that disappeared, every witness who died under suspicious circumstances. Every investigation that was sabotaged represented another link in a chain of corruption that reached into every level of local government. The discovery of Tina Sharp's remains in 1984, 3 years after she had vanished from Cabin 28, provided the final piece of the puzzle that investigators had been missing. The condition of her skeletal remains told a story of prolonged captivity and systematic abuse that exceeded even the horrors found at the original crime scene. Forensic analysis indicated that Tina had been kept alive for months, possibly even years, after the murders of her family members. The location where her body was found, buried in a shallow grave less than 100 yards from a frequently traveled logging road, suggested that she had been held somewhere else entirely before being murdered and disposed of. The fact that multiple search teams had supposedly combed this exact area without finding her remains pointed to either criminal negligence or deliberate misdirection of the search efforts. Tina's skull bore evidence of the same systematic violence that had been inflicted on her family members, including hammer blows delivered with surgical precision to cause maximum pain without immediate death. Her skeletal remains showed signs of healing that indicated she had survived multiple torture sessions, recovering partially before being subjected to additional abuse. The pattern of injuries suggested that her captors had used her as a practice subject for refining their torture techniques. Most horrifying of all were the indications that Tina had been kept conscious and aware throughout most of her captivity. Chemical analysis of her bones revealed traces of stimulants and pain enhancers that would have prevented her from escaping into unconsciousness during her ordeal. Her captors hadn't just wanted to torture her. They had wanted her to experience every moment of her suffering with crystal clarity. The timing of Tina's death, based on forensic evidence, coincided with increased pressure on the investigation during 1983. As Detective Gamberg's review revealed, several witnesses had begun talking to investigators about suspicious activities they had observed around Ketty Resort. Tina's murder appeared to have been timed to send a message to anyone considering cooperation with law enforcement. The revelation that Tina had been held alive for years transformed the case from a triple homicide into something far more sinister. Evidence of a network of predators who specialized in the systematic torture of children. The sophistication of their operations, the resources required to maintain secret facilities, and the level of corruption necessary to operate with impunity suggested connections that reached far beyond Plumas County. Martin Smart's death in 2000, officially ruled a suicide, occurred just weeks after he had been contacted by investigators seeking to reopen the Ketty case. His suicide note, which conveniently confessed to being present during the murders but claimed he had been forced to participate against his will, read more like a legal document designed to protect co-conspirators than a genuine expression of remorse. The circumstances surrounding Smart's death raised more questions than they answered. He had been found in his trailer with a single gunshot wound to the head, but the weapon had been positioned in a manner that made suicide physically awkward if not impossible. More suspicious still was the fact that his trailer had been thoroughly cleaned before police arrived, eliminating any evidence that might have contradicted the suicide narrative. Beau Boubaid's death in 1988, officially attributed to natural causes, had occurred under equally suspicious circumstances. He had been in good health and was scheduled to be interviewed by federal investigators looking into drug trafficking in the Sierra Nevada region. His death prevented what might have been the breakthrough testimony that could have exposed the entire network of corruption and violence. The pattern of convenient deaths that eliminated potential witnesses and suspects became impossible to ignore when viewed as a whole. At least 7 individuals with knowledge of the Ketty murders had died under suspicious circumstances between 1981 and 2000. The statistical probability of so many key figures dying from unrelated causes suggested a systematic campaign of elimination designed to protect the surviving members of the conspiracy. Sheriff Douglas's retirement in 1987, accompanied by a pension that seemed extraordinarily generous given his years of service, marked the end of the most corrupt period in Plumas County law enforcement history. His successor, while more honest, inherited a department so thoroughly compromised that rebuilding credibility took decades. Evidence rooms had to be completely reorganized, files had to be reconstructed from memory, and entire investigations had to be restarted from the beginning. The psychological impact of the Ketty murders and the subsequent cover-up extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The knowledge that an entire law enforcement system could be corrupted to protect child killers shattered the community's faith in institutions they had trusted for generations. Parents who had once felt safe allowing their children to roam freely through the mountain forests became obsessively protective, understanding that monsters could wear badges as easily as they could hide in shadows. Sheila Sharp, the sole survivor of her family, carried the burden of survivor guilt combined with the knowledge that justice for her loved ones had been deliberately denied. Her repeated attempts to get authorities to seriously investigate the murders were met with stonewalling and character assassination designed to discredit her testimony. The system that should have protected her instead treated her as a threat to be neutralized. The emotional toll on Sheila was compounded by the knowledge that she might have saved her family if she had stayed home that night instead of going to the sleepover that preserved her life. The cruel irony that her survival was due to pure chance while her family's deaths were the result of calculated evil created psychological trauma that would require decades of therapy to address. Justin Smart's adult life was shaped by the horror of watching his father and Bo Bubaid torture and murder his friends while being powerless to stop them or seek justice afterward. The adults who should have protected him instead forced him into silence through threats and intimidation that continued long after the original murders. His testimony as an adult, when he finally found the courage to speak the truth, provided crucial evidence that confirmed investigators' suspicions about his father's involvement. The revelation that Justin had been threatened by law enforcement officers to keep quiet about what he had witnessed transformed the case from a simple cover-up into evidence of systematic child abuse by the very system designed to protect children. The psychological damage inflicted on a 12-year-old witness was compounded by decades of forced silence and the knowledge that his coerced testimony had helped his father escape justice. Detective Gamberg's investigation, while ultimately unable to secure convictions due to the systematic destruction of evidence, succeeded in exposing the network of corruption that had protected the killers for so long. His findings documented a conspiracy that involved not just individual officers but entire departments working together to obstruct justice. The scope of the corruption was so complete that it required federal intervention to ensure any semblance of accountability. The federal investigation that followed Gamberg's revelations uncovered evidence of a drug trafficking network that had generated hundreds of millions of dollars in profits over decades of operation. The network had corrupted officials at every level of government, from local sheriff's deputies to federal agents, creating a web of protection that made prosecution nearly impossible. The connection between the drug network and the Ketty murders became clear when investigators discovered that Sue Sharp had been gathering evidence of the operation to report to federal authorities. Her murder, along with the torture and killing of her children, had been ordered to prevent her from exposing a criminal enterprise that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement and government. The systematic torture inflicted on the Sharp family served multiple purposes beyond simple murder. It was designed to send a message to anyone else who might consider challenging the network's operations. The public nature of the crime scene, with bodies left arranged for maximum psychological impact, was intended to demonstrate the consequences of interfering with their business. The failure to solve the Ketty murders represented more than just incompetent police work. It was evidence of a criminal justice system so corrupted by money and power that it had become an instrument of the very criminals it was supposed to pursue. The truth had been buried not through accident or oversight, but through deliberate conspiracy by individuals who understood that exposure would destroy them. As the decades passed and witnesses died, evidence disappeared, and officials retired with their secrets intact, it became clear that justice for the Sharp family would never come through conventional legal channels. The system had been too thoroughly corrupted, the evidence too systematically destroyed, and the remaining witnesses too intimidated to ever secure the convictions that the victims deserve. But the truth, once exposed, has a way of refusing to stay buried. The story of the Ketty murders and the subsequent cover-up serves as a permanent reminder of what happens when institutions designed to protect society instead protect its predators. The blood of innocents cries out from the ground, demanding that their stories be told even when their killers will never face earthly justice. The Sharp family's legacy lives on not in the justice they were denied, but in the lessons their suffering can teach about the price of corruption and the necessity of vigilance against those who would use power to protect evil rather than punish it. Their deaths were not in vain if they serve as warnings about the monsters who hide behind badges and the systems that can be corrupted to serve darkness instead of light. In the end, The Ketty murders represent the ultimate perversion of justice. A case where those sworn to protect and serve instead became accomplices to child killers, where evidence was destroyed to protect the guilty rather than preserve it to convict them, and where the truth was buried so deeply that it may never fully see the light of day. The cabin at 28 Ketty Resort stands empty now, its windows boarded up and its rooms silent. But the echoes of that terrible night in April 1981 continue to reverberate through the mountains, carrying with them the voices of the dead demanding justice and the whispers of the living who know the truth but lack the courage to speak it. Sue Sharp, John Sharp, Dana Wingate, and Tina Sharp died brutal deaths at the hands of monsters who wore human faces. But their greatest tragedy may be that they were betrayed not just by their killers, but by the very system that should have ensured their killers faced consequences. Blood was spilled, lies were told, and truth was buried. But the story refuses to die, serving as an eternal reminder that evil triumphs only when good people choose silence over courage. The Ketty murders will never be officially solved, but the truth has been revealed for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. Justice may have been denied, but the memory of the victims lives on, and their story serves as a warning about the price of corruption and the eternal necessity of fighting for truth, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against it. In memory of Sue, John, Tina, and Dana, may their stories serve as eternal flames illuminating the darkness that can consume even the most beautiful places when evil is allowed to flourish unchecked. Thank you for watching and joining us as we explored these chilling and mysterious stories. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who love a good mystery. Also, let us know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear where in the world you're tuning in. We appreciate you being part of this, and we'll see you next time for more gripping stories. Stay safe, stay curious, and keep unraveling the unknown.